The Night Lords, Chronicles of Terror and Damnation. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the galaxy, where light struggles against an eternal darkness, there exists a world that embodies the very essence of despair. The planet Nostramo hung in the void like a diseased organ, swollen, corrupted, and pulsing with malignant life. Its surface bore the scars of millennia upon millennia of industrial exploitation and moral decay, a testament to humanity's capacity for self-destruction when left unchecked by mercy or justice. Located in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, far from Terra's golden light, this benighted world had long since surrendered any pretense of civilization to the brutal necessities of survival. Towering hive cities stretched toward the perpetually overcast sky like the grasping fingers of the damned, their foundations built upon the bones of earlier settlements, layer upon layer of human habitation, each generation building atop the ruins of the last. Meanwhile, vast mining operations carved ever deeper wounds into the planet's crust, extracting resources with no thought for tomorrow, only the desperate hunger of today. The sun, that ancient symbol of hope and life, rarely penetrated the thick layers of industrial smog and chemical clouds that shrouded Nostramo in eternal twilight. This created a world where darkness reigned supreme, where only the most ruthless could prosper, and where weakness was not merely punished but utterly annihilated. The very atmosphere seemed to press down upon the inhabitants, heavy with toxins and despair, creating an environment that bred only predators and prey. Within the labyrinthine underhives and sprawling industrial complexes, criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple gangs. They had become the de facto rulers of entire districts, sophisticated criminal empires that controlled everything from the flow of narcotics and weapons to the allocation of food and shelter. Murder, extortion, and torture were not aberrations in this society, but standard business practices, the currency of power in a world where weakness invited immediate and merciless exploitation. The planetary government existed only as a hollow shell, a facade of legitimacy that fooled no one. Its officials were either bought, blackmailed, or buried by the crime lords who wielded true power. Law enforcement had become indistinguishable from organized crime, with corrupt enforcers serving whichever master paid best or threatened most convincingly. Justice was not a concept but a commodity, bought and sold like any other resource in Nostramo's dark economy. The population of Nostramo had adapted to this environment over countless generations, developing a culture that prized cunning, brutality, and the ability to inspire fear above all other virtues. Children learned to kill before they could properly read, their education consisting of lessons in survival, betrayal, and violence. Those who survived to adulthood bore the psychological scars of constant violence and betrayal like badges of honor, their souls hardened against the suffering of others. Trust was a luxury few could afford in this nightmarish realm. Mercy was seen as a fatal weakness that would inevitably lead to one's destruction. The strong preyed upon the weak without restraint, creating an endless cycle of violence that permeated every aspect of Nostraman society. It was a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human, where the very concept of compassion had been beaten out of the collective consciousness through generations of suffering. Into this nightmare realm came Konrad Curze, though his arrival went unnoticed by the criminal overlords who thought themselves masters of their domain. The infant Primarch's gestation pod crashed into the depths of Quintus, one of Nostramo's most violent hive cities, where it lay hidden among the industrial wreckage until the child within finally emerged into his new world. Unlike his brothers, many of whom were discovered and raised by caring foster families or noble houses, Curze found himself utterly alone in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or innocent. The young Primarch's early years were a brutal education in survival, as he scavenged for food among the refuse of the underhive, avoiding the predators that stalked the darkness with the instincts of a hunted animal. His superhuman physiology allowed him to endure conditions that would have killed any normal child within days. But it was his mind that truly set him apart from both ordinary humans and the criminals who preyed upon them. Curze possessed an intellect that could analyze and adapt to the twisted logic of Nostramo and society with frightening efficiency, learning to read the subtle signs of danger and opportunity that meant the difference between life and death in the underhive. As he matured, Curze began to experience something that would define his entire existence: visions of possible futures. These were not the controlled four, sight that some of his brothers would later possess, but prophetic dreams that showed him the consequences of various actions and decisions with terrifying clarity. These glimpses of what might come to pass filled him with a growing sense of inevitability and doom, as he saw again and again how violence and corruption would spread like a cancer throughout the galaxy. The visions were not gifts but curses, showing him horrors that he felt powerless to prevent while simultaneously driving him toward the very actions that would bring them about. In these dark revelations, he witnessed betrayal on a cosmic scale, brother turning against brother, and the Imperium his father would build tearing itself apart in an orgy of violence. The transformation from abandoned child to something far more terrible began when Curze reached physical maturity and could no longer remain hidden in the shadows. His first recorded kill was a gang enforcer who had cornered him in a dead-end alley, expecting an easy victim, perhaps a child to torture for amusement or sell into slavery. Instead, the man found himself facing something that moved with inhuman speed and struck with impossible strength. Curze didn't simply kill his attacker. He made the death a message, leaving the corpse displayed in a manner that would haunt anyone who discovered it. The body was arranged with deliberate artistry, positioned to maximize the psychological impact on those who would find it. This was not the work of a frightened child defending himself, but the calculated action of a predator announcing his presence. Word of the mysterious killer spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire, as bodies began appearing throughout Quintus with increasing frequency. Each death was more elaborate than the last, turning murder into a grotesque art form that spoke to the deepest fears of those who found them. Curze had learned the fundamental truth of his world. In a society built on intimidation and fear, the most effective weapon was terror itself. He began to study the psychology of his enemies with the dedication of a scholar, learning exactly how to break their minds before he broke their bodies. The methods employed by this emerging night haunter were not random acts of violence, but carefully calculated campaigns of psychological warfare. He would stalk his targets for days or weeks, learning their routines, their fears, their weaknesses, before finally striking. Sometimes he would kill quickly and cleanly, leaving only a corpse as evidence of his presence, a mercy for those whose crimes were lesser. Other times, he would engage in elaborate games of cat and mouse, allowing his victims to glimpse him in the shadows before vanishing again, driving them to madness with the knowledge that death was stalking them, but never knowing when it would finally arrive. Within a matter of years, this creature of vengeance had systematically dismantled the criminal hierarchy of Quintus through a combination of targeted assassinations and psychological terrorism. Gang leaders who had ruled through fear found themselves cowering in fortified bunkers, afraid to leave their strongholds as their organizations crumbled around them. Those who survived did so only by abandoning their criminal activities and attempting to impose some semblance of order on their territories, knowing that the alternative was a visit from the creature that haunted the darkness. As his reputation grew, Curze began to see himself not as a monster, but as an agent of justice in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The visions that plagued his dreams showed him that only through fear could order be maintained, that only by becoming something more terrible than the criminals themselves could he hope to control them. This twisted logic became the foundation of his philosophy, as he convinced himself that his brutal methods were not only justified but necessary for the greater good. It was a philosophy born of isolation and desperation, shaped by a world that knew only violence and reinforced by prophetic visions that seemed to validate his darkest conclusions about the nature of order and justice. The pacification of Quintus proved to be merely the beginning of a campaign that would reshape an entire world. As the Night Haunter's influence spread to other hive cities across Nostramo, his methods became more sophisticated and far-reaching. He learned to use the planet's communication networks to spread fear even faster than he could travel. Reports of his activities would reach new territories before he did, causing criminal organizations to tear themselves apart in paranoid frenzies as they tried to identify which of their number might be marked for death. The psychological warfare he waged was as effective as any physical campaign could have been. The planetary government, such as it was, initially welcomed the mysterious vigilante, who seemed to be accomplishing what their own forces could. Crime rates plummeted wherever the Night Haunter operated, and for the first time in centuries, ordinary citizens could walk the streets without fear of immediate violence. Markets reopened, trade resumed, and something resembling normal life began to emerge from the shadows. However, as Curze's methods became more extreme, and his definition of criminality expanded to include minor infractions and moral failings, even his supporters began to question whether the cure had become worse than the disease. Public executions became more frequent and more elaborate. Punishments for petty theft began to mirror those once reserved for murder. The Night Haunter's justice was absolute and unyielding, offering no room for mercy or second chances. By the time the Emperor's expeditionary fleets reached Nostramo, Konrad Curze had transformed himself from a feral child into the undisputed master of an entire world. The Night Haunter ruled not through love or loyalty, but through absolute terror, maintaining order through the constant threat of brutal retribution against anyone who dared to transgress against his increasingly rigid moral code. The criminal underworld that had once dominated Nostramo had been replaced by a different kind of tyranny, one that was arguably more effective but no less oppressive than what had come before. The streets were safe, yes, but the population lived in constant fear of transgressing against laws they could barely understand, enforced by a being who seemed to see into their very souls. The reunion between the Emperor and his lost son was unlike any of the other Primarch discoveries, lacking the warmth and celebration that had marked similar events across the galaxy. There were no joyous crowds, no tearful reunions, no stories of noble upbringing to share. Curze had no foster family to mourn his departure, no loyal followers to bid him farewell, and no great achievements to be proud of beyond the systematic terrorization of an entire world. When the Emperor's representatives made contact, they found a being who had shaped himself into the perfect predator for his environment, possessing all the superhuman capabilities of a Primarch, but twisted by years of isolation and exposure to the worst aspects of human nature. The Emperor saw in his son both potential and tragedy, a weapon of unparalleled effectiveness marred by psychological damage that might prove irreparable. The meeting between father and son was tense and awkward, filled with long silences and careful words. Curze looked upon the Emperor with a mixture of awe and suspicion, while the master of mankind gazed upon his creation with an expression that might have been sorrow. What passed between them in those first moments would remain known only to the two of them, but it set the tone for a relationship that would be marked by distance and disappointment. The 8th Legion that awaited their Gene Father had already forged its own dark reputation long before Konrad Curze took command. Originally known as the Revenant Legion during their Terran recruitment phase, these Space Marines had established themselves as specialists in unconventional warfare and psychological operations. Recruited primarily from the prison gangs and underhive populations of Terra, these warriors understood violence and intimidation in ways that their more noble brothers did not. They had learned their lessons in the darkness beneath humanity's birthworld, where survival depended on cunning and ruthlessness rather than honor and valor. They had served with distinction during the early years of the Great Crusade, using terror tactics and night fighting to break enemy morale before conventional forces moved in for the final assault. Their methods were considered distasteful by many of their brother legions, but none could deny their effectiveness. Worlds that might have required months of costly siege warfare to subdue would capitulate within weeks when the Revenant Legion was deployed. However, the arrival of Konrad Curze marked a fundamental transformation in the Legion's character and methods that would push them far beyond their original mandate. The Primarch brought with him not only his own twisted philosophy, but also a new source of recruits from Nostramo itself. The criminal underworld that he had spent years dismantling provided a ready pool of candidates who already possessed the ruthlessness and moral flexibility that the Night Lords, as they would soon be known, would require for their future operations. These were not idealistic young men seeking to serve humanity, but survivors of a brutal world who understood that strength was the only currency that mattered and fear the only reliable tool of control. The recruitment process on Nostramo bore little resemblance to the careful selection and training programs employed by other legions. Curze showed little interest in the noble ideals or heroic traditions that motivated his brothers, instead focusing in identifying individuals who possessed the psychological traits necessary for his particular brand of warfare. Candidates were drawn from the survivors of gang wars, the most successful criminals who had managed to avoid the Night Haunter's purges, and the enforcers who had learned to thrive in Nostramo's brutal environment. These new recruits brought with them the cultural values and practices of their homeworld, gradually influencing the character of the entire Legion. The Terran-born Night Lords found themselves adapting to methods that would have horrified their former selves. As the Nostraman influence spread through the ranks like a virus, traditional concepts of honor and duty were replaced by a more pragmatic approach that valued results over methods, effectiveness over ethics. The transformation was not immediate, but occurred gradually over several decades as the Legion's recruitment base shifted from Terra to Nostramo. Veterans who had served since the early days of the Great Crusade found themselves increasingly outnumbered by younger Marines who had never known any other way of life than the brutal pragmatism of their homeworld. The Legion's traditions and customs evolved to accommodate these new influences, creating a unique culture that combined the discipline and organization of the Adeptus Astartes with the predatory instincts and moral flexibility of Nostramo's criminal underworld. Squad rituals began to incorporate elements of Nostraman gang culture. The symbolic flaying of defeated enemies, once an occasional practice, became standard procedure. The collection of trophies from victims evolved from simple battlefield souvenirs into elaborate displays of terror. The gene seed implantation process itself began to reflect these changes, as the Legion's apothecaries noticed subtle mutations and psychological aberrations appearing with increasing frequency. Whether these changes were due to environmental factors on Nostramo, the influence of Curze on genetic material, or simply the natural result of recruiting from such a corrupted population, remained unclear. What was certain was that each new generation of Night Lords seemed more prone to violent impulses and sadistic tendencies than the last. The apothecaries documented these changes in their reports, noting increased aggression, reduced empathy, and a disturbing enthusiasm for their work that went beyond mere professional dedication. The transformation of the 8th Legion under Konrad Curze's leadership revealed the true extent of the Primarch's psychological deterioration, though few within the Imperium recognized the warning signs at the time. As the Night Lords adapted to their Gene Father's methods and philosophy, Curze himself was wrestling with visions that grew increasingly vivid and disturbing with each passing year. These prophetic glimpses of possible futures were not the controlled foresight that some of his brothers possessed, but chaotic torrents of imagery that assaulted his consciousness without warning or mercy. The visions came to Curze in fragments and flashes, showing him scenes of betrayal, civil war, and the eventual collapse of everything the Emperor sought to build. He witnessed his brother Horus standing over the Emperor's broken form, saw loyal Primarchs turning against each other in bitter warfare, and observed the Imperium tearing itself apart in an orgy of violence that would dwarf even Nostramo's worst excesses. These glimpses of the future were accompanied by an overwhelming sense of inevitability, as if the events he witnessed had already occurred, and he was merely observing historical records rather than potential outcomes. What tormented Curze most was not simply the content of these visions, but his growing realization that he himself played a crucial role in bringing them to pass. He saw himself standing alongside traitor forces, witnessed his own legion committing atrocities that made their current methods seem restrained by comparison, and observed his own hands stained with the blood of those who had once called him brother. The knowledge that he was destined to become a traitor to the Imperium filled him with a mixture of rage and despair that further accelerated his psychological decline. The Primarch's attempts to change or prevent the futures he witnessed only seemed to make them more likely to occur. When he tried to warn the Emperor about potential betrayals, his words were dismissed as the paranoid ravings of a damaged mind. The master of mankind would listen with apparent patience, but Curze could see the doubt in his eyes, the unspoken conclusion that his son's experiences on Nostramo had broken something fundamental within him. When he attempted to forge closer bonds with his brothers, his efforts were rebuffed by Primarchs who found his methods and philosophy increasingly repugnant. Robout Guilliman would lecture him about the proper conduct of warfare. Rogel Dorn would question his hunt. Or even Horus, who would later embrace treachery himself, seemed uncomfortable with Curze's brutal pragmatism. Each failure to alter the course of events drove Curze deeper into fatalistic despair, convincing him that free will was an illusion, and that all beings were merely actors playing predetermined roles in a cosmic tragedy. This philosophical crisis manifested itself in Curze's increasingly erratic behavior and his growing obsession with the concept of justice. The Primarch had convinced himself that his brutal methods on Nostramo had been necessary to bring order to a chaotic world, but the visions showed him that his definition of justice was fundamentally flawed. He began to question whether terror could truly create lasting compliance, or if it merely suppressed criminal behavior without addressing its underlying causes. The internal conflict between Curze's desire for justice and his reliance on terror as a tool of control created a philosophical paradox that his damaged psyche could not resolve. He understood intellectually that fear-based compliance was temporary and required constant reinforcement through increasingly extreme measures. Yet he could conceive of no alternative method that would be equally effective. The visions of future betrayals and civil wars seemed to validate his belief that only through absolute terror could order be maintained, even as they demonstrated the ultimate failure of his approach. As the psychological pressure mounted, Curze began to experience what could only be described as a fracturing of his personality. The rational, analytical mind that had allowed him to survive and thrive on Nostramo found itself at war with a darker aspect of his nature that reveled in violence and suffering for their own sake. This internal conflict manifested as conversations between two distinct personas. Konrad Curze, the troubled Primarch who genuinely believed he was serving the greater good, and the Night Haunter, a predatory entity that embraced cruelty as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. The Night Haunter persona represented everything that Curze feared he was becoming, a creature of pure malevolence that found satisfaction in the suffering of others. During his episodes, he would argue with this darker self, sometimes aloud in the presence of his subordinates, defending his actions as necessary for maintaining order, while the Night Haunter mocked his justifications and urged him toward ever greater extremes of violence. These conversations revealed the depth of Curze's self-loathing and his growing awareness that he had become the very thing he had once sought to destroy. His captains would find him alone in his chambers, engaged in heated debates with himself, his voice shifting between the reasoned tones of Konrad Curze and the savage snarls of the Night Haunter. The Primarch's relationship with his legion became increasingly complex as his psychological condition deteriorated. To his sons, Curze represented both a father figure to be revered and a source of corruption that was gradually poisoning their souls. The Night Lords looked to their Gene Father for guidance and approval, but the lessons he taught them were fundamentally destructive to their humanity and their loyalty to the Imperium's ideals. Curze's interactions with his captains and senior officers revealed the extent to which his philosophy had infected the Legion's command structure. He would lecture them on the necessity of fear as a tool of compliance, using examples from his own experiences on Nostramo to justify increasingly extreme methods of warfare. The Primarch's arguments were logical and compelling, backed by empirical evidence of their effectiveness in achieving rapid victory with minimal casualties among his own forces. Terror campaigns that might have taken other legions months to complete could be accomplished by the Night Lords in weeks, with far fewer casualties to Imperial forces. However, the cost of these victories was measured not in lives lost, but in souls corrupted. Each campaign fought using Night Lords methods left the participating Space Marines slightly more callous, slightly more willing to inflict unnecessary suffering, and slightly more divorced from the humanitarian ideals that had originally motivated the Great Crusade. The Primarch seemed unaware of this gradual corruption, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it in favor of focusing on the immediate tactical advantages his methods provided. After all, worlds were brought into compliance, rebellions were crushed, and the Emperor's domain expanded. What did it matter if his sons became monsters in the process? The recruitment and training of new Night Lords from Nostramo accelerated this process of moral decay within the Legion. Unlike the Terran-born Marines who had at least some exposure to the Imperium's ideals before joining the 8th Legion, the Nostraman recruits brought with them a worldview that was already indamently corrupted. They saw nothing wrong with torture, murder, and intimidation as tools of statecraft, having grown up in a society where such methods were not only accepted but necessary for survival. Curze made no effort to rehabilitate these new recruits or instill them with more noble values. Instead, he embraced their criminal backgrounds as assets that would make them more effective warriors in the style of warfare he preferred. The Primarch would often tell his officers that conventional morality was a luxury that the Imperium could not afford, that the galaxy was too dangerous and filled with too many threats to allow for squeamishness about methods. This philosophy created a feedback loop within the Legion, as the Nostraman recruits influenced their Terran brothers, while being reinforced in their own beliefs by the Primarch's approval. The Night Lords developed their own internal culture that celebrated ruthlessness and efficiency, while scorning concepts like mercy and honor as weaknesses that would only serve to prolong conflicts and increase casualties on both sides. Veterans would tell newer recruits stories of particularly effective terror campaigns, describing in clinical detail the methods used to break enemy resistance and the psychological effects achieved. These tales became a form of oral tradition, passed down through generations of Night Lords, and evolving with each retelling until they took on an almost mythological quality. The Primarch's role as a corrupting influence extended beyond simple tactical doctrine to encompass the fundamental character of his sons. Curze would often share his visions with selected officers, describing the betrayals and civil wars that he claimed were inevitable, while emphasizing that only the strong would survive the coming chaos. These revelations served to justify increasingly extreme measures as necessary preparations for the dark times ahead, gradually conditioning the Night Lords to accept that betrayal and violence were natural aspects of existence, rather than aberrations to be prevented. The psychological impact of serving under such a leader was profound and lasting. Night Lords who had once taken pride in their service to the Imperium began to see themselves as predators whose role was to cull the weak and maintain order through fear. The traditional bonds of brotherhood that existed between Space Marines were replaced by relationships based on mutual benefit and shared complicity in increasingly heinous acts. Trust became conditional, loyalty transactional. Brothers-in-arms became partners in atrocity, bound together not by noble purpose, but by their shared descent into darkness. Curze's treatment of failure within his legion revealed another aspect of his corrupted nature. Unlike other Primarchs who might discipline errant subordinates through additional training or temporary demotion, the Night Haunter's punishments were designed to serve as examples to others rather than opportunities for redemption. Public executions, torture sessions, and psychological torment became standard responses to perceived failures, creating an atmosphere of constant fear, even among the Legion's own ranks. A Night Lord who failed in his mission might find himself flayed alive in front of his brothers, his screams serving as a lesson in the consequences of incompetence. The Primarch justified these extreme disciplinary measures as necessary for maintaining unit cohesion and preventing the kind of moral decay that he claimed had destroyed Nostramo's original criminal organizations. He argued that Space Marines required harsher discipline than ordinary humans due to their enhanced capabilities and the greater damage they could cause if they became corrupted or rebellious. This logic was superficially sound, but ignored the psychological damage that such methods inflicted on the survivors and their growing resentment toward their Gene Father. Fear could ensure obedience, but it could never inspire true loyalty. As the Great Crusade progressed, and the Night Lords participated in more campaigns across the galaxy, the gap between their methods and those of other legions became increasingly apparent. Complaints began to reach Terra about the 8th Legion's conduct, with reports of unnecessary brutality, excessive civilian casualties, and the systematic use of terror tactics against compliant populations. These reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, the inevitable friction that arose when different military cultures came into contact. However, their frequency and consistency eventually attracted the attention of higher authorities within the Imperium. Curze's response to criticism of his methods revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration and his growing alienation from his brothers. Rather than attempting to address legitimate concerns about his Legion's conduct, he became defensive and paranoid, interpreting any criticism as evidence of a conspiracy against him. The Primarch began to see himself as the only one willing to employ the harsh measures necessary for the Imperium's survival, surrounded by naive idealists who would rather see the galaxy burn than compromise their precious principles. This persecution complex was reinforced by his visions of future betrayals, which seemed to validate his belief that his brothers were plotting against him. The fact that these visions showed him as one of the traitors created a paradox that his fractured mind could not resolve, leading to increasingly erratic behavior and outbursts of violence against anyone who questioned his authority or methods. He would fly into rages during war council meetings, accusing his brothers of hypocrisy and weakness. On one memorable occasion, he physically attacked Rogel Dorn after the Imperial Fist's Primarch questioned the necessity of flaying captured prisoners, an incident that required the intervention of multiple Primarchs to prevent serious bloodshed. The philosophical conflict between justice and terror that had begun on Nostramo continued to evolve as Curze's understanding of both concepts became increasingly distorted. He began to argue that justice was simply another word for the imposition of order through superior force, that moral considerations were irrelevant as long as the desired outcome was achieved. This twisted interpretation allowed him to justify any action, no matter how extreme, as serving the cause of justice. The ends justified the means, and the ends he sought, order, compliance, peace through fear, were surely worth any price. The Night Haunter persona grew stronger during this period, taking control more frequently and for longer durations. During these episodes, Curze would abandon any pretense of serving the greater good and openly revel in the suffering of his enemies. The rational justifications that Konrad Curze provided for his actions were replaced by simple sadistic pleasure, revealing the true nature of what he had become. His captains learned to recognize the signs of these transformations: the change in his voice, the predatory gleam in his eyes, the way he would smile while describing the tortures to be inflicted upon their next victims. The Night Lord's approach to warfare represented a fundamental departure from the conventional tactics employed by other Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade, where the Imperial Fists built impregnable fortifications and the Iron Hands relied on overwhelming firepower. The 8th Legion perfected the art of psychological warfare, transforming terror from a byproduct of conflict into a precision weapon capable of achieving strategic objectives without firing a single shot. This doctrine emerged from the unique circumstances of Nostramo's criminal underworld, where the ability to inspire fear often proved more valuable than raw physical strength or superior numbers. The Legion's combat methodology, centered on the principle that breaking an enemy's will to fight, was far more efficient than destroying their capacity to resist. Curze had observed during his years as the Night Haunter that even the most heavily armed criminal organizations would collapse once their leadership lost confidence in their ability to maintain control. This insight formed the foundation of the Night Lord's tactical philosophy, which sought to identify and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of their opponents, rather than simply overwhelming them through superior firepower or numbers. A broken mind was a more complete victory than a broken body, and the effects would spread like a virus through the enemy population. Jump pack assault formations became the signature element of Night Lord's operations, though their implementation differed significantly from the aerial assault tactics employed by legions like the Blood Angels or Raven Guard. Rather than seeking to achieve tactical surprise through speed and mobility alone, the Night Lords used their jump packs to create a sense of omnipresent menace that could strike from any direction at any time. Their assault marines would appear briefly on the battlefield's periphery, inflict casualties on isolated units or command elements, then vanish back into the darkness before enemy forces could respond effectively. These hit-and-run attacks served multiple purposes beyond simple attrition warfare. The unpredictable nature of the assaults prevented enemy commanders from establishing secure positions or maintaining effective communication with their subordinates. Troops who might have fought bravely in conventional engagements found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, and firing at imagined threats. The psychological strain of never knowing when or where the next attack would come gradually eroded unit cohesion and combat effectiveness more thoroughly than sustained bombardment or frontal assault ever could. sleep became impossible. Meals were interrupted by false alarms. The very act of standing watch became an exercise in mounting terror. The Night Lord's preference for lightning claws as their primary close combat weapons reflected both practical and psychological considerations. The twin-bladed power weapons were ideally suited for the quick, brutal engagements that characterized their assault tactics, capable of rending through armor and flesh with equal efficiency. However, the weapon's true value lay in its ability to inflict wounds that were as psychologically traumatic as they were physically devastating. The parallel cuts left by lightning claws created distinctive injury patterns that became synonymous with Night Lord's attacks, serving as calling cards that identified the perpetrators long after the fighting had ended. The sight of comrades torn apart by lightning claws had a profound impact on enemy morale that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Survivors would spread word of the distinctive wounds, creating a growing reputation for the Night Lords that preceded them to new battlefields. Enemy forces who had never encountered the 8th Legion directly would already be demoralized by stories of their methods, making them more susceptible to the psychological pressure that formed the core of Night Lord's strategy. Medical personnel attempting to treat the wounded would find themselves traumatized by the sheer brutality of the injuries, their horror spreading like contagion through field hospitals and aid stations. Terror weapons represented another crucial component of the Legion's arsenal, though their application went far beyond simple intimidation. Weapons like chainswords, flensing knives, and various torture implements were selected not for their combat effectiveness, but for their ability to inflict maximum psychological trauma on both victims and witnesses. The distinctive sound of a chainsword's motor, or the sight of specialized torture equipment, could trigger panic responses in enemy forces even before actual combat began. The Night Lords understood that the anticipation of pain could be as effective as pain itself in breaking the human spirit. The systematic use of flaying, crucifixion, and other forms of public brutality became integral to Night Lords' operations, though these practices served strategic rather than sadistic purposes, at least initially. Curze had learned on Nostramo that the public display of punishment was often more effective than the punishment itself, creating lasting impressions that would influence behavior long after the immediate threat had passed. The 8th Legion applied this principle on a planetary scale, using captured enemies as examples that would encourage compliance from entire populations. Flaying operations were conducted with clinical precision, designed to maximize both the suffering of the victim and the psychological impact on observers. Night Lords' apothecaries developed techniques for keeping victims alive throughout the process, ensuring that their screams would continue for hours or even days. The flayed skins were then displayed in prominent locations, where they would serve as permanent reminders of the consequences of resistance. These displays were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully calculated psychological operations designed to break the will of entire populations. The skins would be arranged in patterns, sometimes spelling out messages or forming images that reinforced the Night Lord's reputation for artistic brutality. Crucifixion served a similar function, but was typically reserved for enemy leaders or individuals whose deaths would have particular symbolic significance. The Night Lords would often crucify entire command structures in full view of their subordinates, demonstrating the futility of resistance while simultaneously eliminating the organizational capacity necessary for coordinated opposition. The slow, public nature of crucifixion ensured that news of the executions would spread throughout enemy territories, creating fear and despair that would undermine morale across entire sectors. Some crucifixions were staged along major transportation routes, creating literal roads of the damned that could be seen from orbit. Mass displays of brutality became standard practice during Night Lords' compliance operations, with entire city squares or military installations transformed into galleries of horror, designed to break the spirit of any who witnessed them. These displays were carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact, with victims arranged in patterns that would be visible from orbit or positioned along major transportation routes where they would be encountered by the maximum number of people. The Legion's understanding of human psychology allowed them to create scenes that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives, ensuring that the terror they inspired would continue long after the Night Lords had moved on to their next target. The Legion's specialization in night fighting represented both a practical adaptation to their preferred operating conditions and a psychological weapon in its own right. Darkness had always been the Night Lord's natural element, dating back to Curze's early years in the perpetual twilight of Nostramos under hives. The 8th Legion's enhanced vision and specialized equipment allowed them to operate effectively in conditions that would blind their enemies. But the true advantage lay in the primal fear that darkness evoked in most sentient species. Humanity's ancient terror of the dark, inherited from prehistoric ancestors who huddled around fires to ward off predators, proved to be a vulnerability that the Night Lords exploited with ruthless efficiency. Night fighting techniques developed by the Legion went far beyond simple low-light operations. Night Lord squads would systematically eliminate artificial lighting sources in target areas, plunging entire installations into darkness before beginning their assault. Specialized equipment allowed them to create zones of absolute darkness that their enemies could not penetrate, turning familiar terrain into alien landscapes where every shadow might conceal a threat. The systematic destruction of lights became a signature of their approach. First, the outer perimeter would go dark, then interior sections, until defenders found themselves isolated in shrinking pools of illumination, surrounded by an encroaching void. The psychological impact of fighting in darkness was amplified by the Night Lord's use of sound as a weapon. Voxcasters would broadcast recordings of screams, chains rattling, and other disturbing noises designed to unnerve enemy forces and mask the sounds of actual movement. These audio assaults were carefully timed to coincide with actual attacks, creating confusion about the location and strength of Night Lord's forces while simultaneously undermining enemy morale. The recordings were often taken from previous victims, their dying moments preserved and weaponized to terrorize future enemies. Stealth warfare techniques perfected during the Great Crusade allowed the Night Lords to achieve tactical objectives without direct confrontation, though their definition of stealth differed significantly from that employed by other legions. Rather than seeking to remain completely undetected, the 8th Legion used partial concealment and misdirection to create uncertainty about their presence and intentions. Enemy forces might catch glimpses of Night Lords moving through the shadows or hear sounds that suggested their presence, without being able to confirm their exact location or numbers. This deliberate ambiguity was more effective than complete invisibility, as it kept enemies in a constant state of anxious vigilance. This approach to stealth warfare created a constant state of tension among enemy forces who knew they were being watched, but could never be certain when or where an attack might come. The psychological strain of maintaining constant vigilance gradually wore down even the most disciplined troops, leading to mistakes and poor decisions that the Night Lords could exploit. Units that might have fought effectively in conventional engagements would often break and run when faced with the uncertainty and fear that characterized Night Lords' operations. Sentries would shoot at shadows. Officers would see Night Lords in every dark corner. The line between paranoia and justified caution became impossible to distinguish. Infiltration techniques developed by the Legion focused on psychological disruption, rather than simple reconnaissance or sabotage. Night Lords infiltrators would plant evidence of their presence in enemy installations, leaving behind calling cards or disturbing imagery designed to unnerve the occupants. These psychological operations could continue for weeks or months before any actual attack, gradually eroding enemy morale and creating an atmosphere of paranoia that would make coordinated resistance more difficult. A flayed glove left on a commander's desk, a message written in blood on a barracks wall, the body of a sentry found in an impossible location, arranged in a position that suggested he had been placed there as a warning. Voxcaster broadcasts became one of the Night Lord's most effective weapons, allowing them to project their influence across entire star systems without deploying a single warrior. These transmissions were carefully crafted to exploit the specific fears and cultural taboos of their target populations, often incorporating intelligence gathered through torture or interrogation of captured enemies. The broadcasts would begin days or weeks before actual military operations, preparing the psychological battlefield and softening enemy resistance. Some populations would surrender before the Night Lords even arrived, having been broken by weeks of listening to the screams of those who had resisted before them. The content of these broadcasts varied depending on the target audience and strategic objectives, but all shared certain common elements designed to maximize their psychological impact. Recordings of previous victims' screams were often incorporated into the transmissions, serving as proof of the Night Lord's capabilities while simultaneously threatening similar treatment for those who continued to resist. Detailed descriptions of torture techniques and execution methods were provided to ensure that listeners understood exactly what awaited them if they chose to fight. The broadcasts were engineered to be impossible to ignore or forget, their messages burrowing into the subconscious mind and emerging in nightmares. Fear propaganda developed by the Legion went beyond simple threats to encompass sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to exploit fundamental human weaknesses. Night Lords propaganda specialists studied the mythology, religion, and cultural beliefs of their target populations, identifying specific fears and superstitions that could be weaponized. These psychological profiles were then used to craft messages that would resonate with deep-seated anxieties and trigger panic responses even among disciplined military forces. A population that feared desecration of the dead would see images of defiled corpses. A culture that revered their leaders would witness those leaders being systematically humiliated and destroyed. The timing and delivery of these propaganda broadcasts were as important as their content. Transmissions would often begin during periods when enemy forces were already under stress, such as during shift changes or meal times when normal routines were disrupted. The broadcasts would be repeated at irregular intervals to prevent enemy forces from adapting to them, with the content gradually escalating in intensity as actual military operations approached. The unpredictability kept populations in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next transmission would come or what horrors it would reveal. Breaking enemy morale before battles even began became the primary objective of Night Lord's psychological operations, with actual combat serving as a secondary consideration. The Legion's commanders understood that troops who were already demoralized and frightened would be far easier to defeat than those who maintained confidence in their cause and their commanders. This approach often allowed the Night Lords to achieve strategic objectives with minimal casualties among their own forces, though the psychological cost to enemy populations was invariably severe. The effectiveness of these pre-battle psychological operations was measured not in enemy casualties, but in the speed and completeness of their surrender. Successful Night Lords campaigns would often see entire planetary governments capitulate without firing a shot, their will to resist broken by weeks or months of psychological pressure. These bloodless victories were held up as examples of the Legion's tactical superiority, though critics argued that the long-term psychological damage inflicted on compliant populations was ultimately more destructive than conventional warfare. Populations that surrendered without fighting often suffered worse fates than those who resisted, as the Night Lords would use them as examples to terrify the next target. The integration of all these elements into a coherent combat doctrine required extensive coordination between different specialist units within the Legion. Terror assault squads equipped with jump packs and close combat weapons would work in conjunction with psychological warfare specialists and stealth infiltration teams to create multi-layered campaigns that attacked enemy forces on physical, psychological, and moral levels simultaneously. This combined approach made the Night Lords uniquely effective at achieving rapid compliance from resistant populations, though the methods employed often left lasting scars that would influence the character of conquered worlds for generations to come. The Night Lords' integration into the broader Imperial war machine during the early decades of the Great Crusade initially proceeded with remarkable success, as their unconventional methods proved devastatingly effective against the diverse array of enemies encountered across the galaxy's outer reaches. The 8th Legion's reputation for rapid compliance operations spread throughout the Imperial War Councils, earning them deployment to some of the most challenging theaters where conventional tactics had failed to achieve decisive results. Worlds that had resisted Imperial authority for years would fall within weeks of the Night Lord's arrival. Rebellions that had consumed the lives of countless Imperial Army soldiers would evaporate in the face of systematic terror. However, these early victories came at a cost that would not become apparent until years late. As each successful campaign further corrupted the Legion's character and drove them deeper into the darkness that would eventually consume them entirely. The moral compromises that seemed justified in the pursuit of quick victory became habits, then standard procedure, and finally defining characteristics of the Legion itself. What began as tactical flexibility evolved into moral relativism and eventually into outright sadism. The Chero system compliance stands as perhaps the most infamous example of Night Lords' methodology during this period, demonstrating both the tactical brilliance and moral bankruptcy that characterized their operations. The system consisted of 7 inhabited worlds ruled by a confederation of merchant princes who had initially welcomed Imperial contact before rejecting the terms of compliance when they realized the economic implications of joining the Imperium. Their merchant fleets controlled the trade routes that connected dozens of systems, and their commercial interests extended across multiple sectors. Standard Imperial doctrine would have called for a prolonged siege of the heavily fortified trade stations that controlled the system's shipping lanes, potentially requiring months of costly warfare to achieve victory. Curze approached the problem with characteristic ruthlessness, identifying the Merchant Confederation's fundamental weakness as their dependence on maintaining public confidence in their ability to protect trade routes and commercial interests. Rather than attacking the fortified positions directly, the Night Lords began a systematic campaign of terror against civilian shipping throughout the system. Merchant vessels were boarded, and their crews subjected to elaborate torture sessions that were broadcast across the system's communication networks, with the victims' screams serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of continued resistance. The psychological impact of these attacks was amplified by their seemingly random nature, as the Night Lords deliberately avoided establishing any pattern that might allow the merchant princes to predict where the next strike would occur. Cargo haulers carrying essential supplies to outer worlds would simply vanish without trace, their crews discovered days later in escape pods bearing evidence of systematic brutalization. Passenger liners were boarded, and their occupants subjected to public executions that were transmitted live to every inhabited world in the system, creating a climate of terror that paralyzed commercial activity throughout the region. Within 3 weeks of the campaign's beginning, the Merchant Confederation's economy had collapsed as shipping companies refused to operate in the system and trade partners severed their commercial relationships rather than risk association with the targeted worlds. The Confederation's military forces remained intact, and their fortifications were undamaged, but their ability to maintain political control had been completely undermined by the Night Lords' systematic destruction of public confidence in their government's competence. The merchant princes found themselves besieged not by imperial forces, but by their own terrified populations, who blamed them for bringing this nightmare upon them. The final phase of the Cherout compliance involved a single, carefully orchestrated display of brutality that broke the Confederation's will to resist entirely. Night Lords' assault teams simultaneously struck the personal residences of all 7 merchant princes, capturing their families and transporting them to the system's primary trade station. The captured civilians were then subjected to public flaying in the station's main commercial district, with the executions broadcast throughout the system as Curze personally delivered an ultimatum demanding immediate surrender. The merchant princes capitulated within hours, formally requesting imperial protection from the terror that had consumed their system. The Night Lords had achieved complete victory without engaging a single enemy military unit in conventional combat, demonstrating the effectiveness of their psychological warfare doctrine, while simultaneously establishing a precedent for the extreme methods that would characterize their future operations. The Cherout system would become a model for Night Lords campaigns across the galaxy, and a cautionary tale of what happened when terror became not merely a tool, but the primary objective. Similar successes followed across dozens of star systems as the Night Lords refined their techniques and expanded their repertoire of terror tactics. The Cravashi Rebellion was crushed when Night Lords infiltrators poisoned the water supply of the rebel capital with hallucinogenic compounds that caused the population to experience collective nightmares, breaking their resistance without firing a shot. Thousands went mad in a single night, their screams echoing through the streets as they expired. Instead, visions of horrors tailored to their deepest fears. The Eshan Confederacy surrendered after witnessing the systematic crucifixion of their entire diplomatic corps, broadcast live across their communication networks as a demonstration of imperial resolve. The bodies were left hanging for months, visible from orbit, a permanent reminder of the price of defiance. These victories earned the 8th Legion considerable recognition within Imperial command circles, where their ability to achieve rapid compliance with minimal casualties among Imperial forces was seen as a valuable asset in the Imperium's expanding war effort. The Night Lords were increasingly deployed to situations where conventional tactics had failed, or where the political situation required a swift resolution that would discourage similar rebellions in neighboring systems. Their reputation for effectiveness preceded them to new battlefields, often causing enemy forces to surrender before actual combat began. However, the growing frequency and severity of the Night Lords' terror campaigns began to attract criticism from other legions whose commanders witnessed the aftermath of 8th Legion operations. The Imperial Fists were among the first to raise concerns about the Night Lords' methods, particularly after joint operations in the Ghoul Stars region, where both legions were deployed to suppress a series of coordinated rebellions against Imperial authority. Rogel Dorn's forces had been assigned to fortify key strategic positions, while the Night Lords conducted compliance operations on rebel worlds. But the Imperial Fists commanders were horrified by what they discovered when they arrived to establish their defensive positions. Entire cities had been transformed into monuments to terror, with the crucified remains of rebel leaders lining every major thoroughfare and public buildings converted into torture chambers, where captured civilians were subjected to systematic brutalization. The Imperial Fist's protests focused not on the effectiveness of these methods, but on their compatibility with the Imperium's stated goals of bringing civilization and order to the galaxy. Dorn himself confronted Curze directly about the excessive nature of his legion's tactics, arguing that such extreme measures would create lasting resentment among compliant populations and potentially destabilize entire sectors through the psychological trauma they inflicted. Curze's response revealed the extent to which his philosophy had diverged from mainstream imperial doctrine, as he argued that fear was the only reliable method of ensuring long-term compliance from conquered populations. The Night Haunter maintained that the temporary suffering inflicted during compliance operations was preferable to the prolonged warfare that would result from inadequate initial suppression of resistance. His logic was coldly rational, but ignored the moral implications of his methods and their impact on the civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The philosophical divide between the Imperial Fists and Night Lords reflected broader tensions within the Space Marine legions about acceptable methods of warfare and the proper relationship between Imperial forces and civilian populations. The Imperial Fists represented the traditional view that Space Marines should serve as protectors of humanity, using their enhanced capabilities to shield the innocent from the galaxy's dangers. The Night Lords embodied a darker interpretation of their role, viewing themselves as predators whose function was to eliminate threats through whatever means proved most effective, regardless of the moral cost. These tensions escalated during joint operations in the Thramas sector, where Imperial Fists and Night Lords forces were deployed together to suppress a large-scale rebellion that had spread across multiple star systems. The campaign's initial phases proceeded smoothly, with Imperial Fists forces establishing secure bases, while Night Lords units conducted terror operations against rebel strongholds. However, the cooperation broke down when Imperial Fists commanders discovered that Night Lords forces were systematically executing prisoners of war and civilian refugees who had fled rebel-controlled territories. The confrontation between Dorn and Curze that followed this discovery nearly resulted in open warfare between the two legions, as both Primarchs refused to compromise on their fundamental principles. Dorn demanded that the Night Lords cease their execution of prisoners and begin following standard Imperial protocols for the treatment of captured enemies, while Curze insisted that such measures were necessary to prevent the rebellion from spreading to other sectors. The dispute was eventually resolved through intervention from the War Council, but the underlying tensions remained unaddressed and would continue to fester throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade. The Ultramarines proved even more vocal in their criticism of Night Lords' methods, particularly after witnessing the aftermath of the Carthage compliance, where an entire hive city had been systematically depopulated through a combination of mass executions and psychological warfare. Robout Guilliman's forces had been assigned to establish administrative control over the conquered world, but they found a population so traumatized by their experiences under Night Lord's occupation that normal governance was impossible to implement. Guilliman's complaints focused on the practical difficulties created by the Night Lord's excessive use of terror tactics, arguing that their methods made post-compliance reconstruction far more difficult and expensive than necessary. The Ultramarines Primarch presented detailed analyses showing that worlds conquered through Night Lords operations required significantly more resources to pacify and integrate into the Imperium than those brought into compliance through conventional means. The infrastructure damage was often minimal, but the psychological damage rendered populations nearly incapable of self-governance for years afterward. The economic arguments against Night Lord's methods were compelling, but they failed to address Curze's fundamental belief that fear was the most reliable tool for maintaining order across the Imperium's vast territories. The Night Haunter argued that the initial investment in terror operations would pay long-term dividends by preventing future rebellions and reducing the need for ongoing military occupation of conquered worlds. His position was supported by statistical evidence showing that worlds conquered by the Night Lords experienced lower rates of subsequent rebellion than those brought into compliance through other means, though whether this was due to genuine loyalty or simply paralytic fear remained an open question. This debate highlighted a fundamental disagreement about the nature of imperial rule and the relationship between the Imperium and its subject populations. The Ultramarines favored an approach that emphasized integration and assimilation, bringing conquered worlds into the imperial fold through a combination of military pressure and administrative efficiency. The Night Lords preferred a model based on deterrence and intimidation, maintaining control through the constant threat of brutal retaliation against any sign of disloyalty. The growing criticism from other legions began to isolate the Night Lords within the broader imperial military structure, as their reputation for excessive brutality made other commanders reluctant to work with them. Joint operations became increasingly rare, as Legion commanders requested that their forces be deployed separately from the 8th Legion, citing concerns about the impact of Night Lords' methods on their own troops' morale and discipline. This isolation was compounded by reports from Imperial Army units that had served alongside the Night Lords, describing the psychological impact of witnessing their terror operations. Ordinary human soldiers who had volunteered to serve the Emperor's vision of a unified humanity found themselves traumatized by exposure to the systematic brutality that characterized Night Lords' campaigns. Medical reports documented increasing rates of psychological breakdown among Imperial Army personnel deployed with the 8th Legion, leading to requests that such joint deployments be discontinued. Some army regiments that had fought alongside the Night Lords never fully recovered, their soldiers haunted by what they had witnessed and unable to reconcile their experiences with their idealistic reasons for joining the Imperial military. The Night Lords' response to this growing criticism was to become even more insular and defensive about their methods, interpreting complaints as evidence of weakness and moral squeamishness among their fellow Imperial forces. Curze encouraged this attitude among his subordinates, arguing that the other legions lacked the moral courage necessary to make the hard decisions required for the Imperium's survival. This philosophy created a siege mentality within the 8th Legion that further separated them from their brother legions and reinforced their belief that they alone understood the true nature of warfare in the 31st millennium. The situation was further complicated by the gradual deterioration of conditions on Nostramo itself, as the world that had produced the Night Lords began to revert to its original state of criminal anarchy. Curze's departure to join the Great Crusade had removed the primary source of terror that had maintained order on the planet, and without the Night Haunter's constant presence, the criminal organizations that he had suppressed began to reassert their control over the hive cities and industrial complexes. The resurgence of criminal activity on Nostramo was initially dismissed as a temporary setback that would be corrected once the Night RDS returned from their campaigns. However, reports from Imperial administrators assigned to oversee the planet's contribution to the Great Crusade painted an increasingly grim picture of a world sliding back into chaos. The criminal organizations that emerged were often led by individuals who had survived the Night Haunter's original purges, and they possessed an intimate understanding of terror tactics that they used to establish their own brutal regimes. These new crime lords had learned from Curze's example, adopting his methods while lacking his philosophical justifications for their use of violence. The result was a society that combined the worst aspects of Nostramo's original criminal culture with the systematic brutality that the Night Haunter had introduced, creating a population that was even more corrupted than the one that had originally produced Konrad Curze. The planet had become a factory for producing monsters, churning out recruits who were already broken before they ever received the gene seed. The Night Lords recruited from this increasingly degraded population showed the effects of their homeworld's moral decay, displaying levels of sadism and brutality that shocked even veteran members of the Legion. These new recruits brought with them cultural practices and attitudes that pushed the 8th Legion further toward the extremes of violence and cruelty, accelerating the corruption that was already spreading through their ranks. Where older Night Lords might still rationalize their actions as serving a strategic purpose, these new recruits reveled in cruelty for its own sake. Reports of atrocities committed by newly recruited Night Lords began to reach the attention of Imperial authorities, describing incidents where Space Marines had engaged in torture and murder for purely personal gratification rather than tactical necessity. These reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, but their frequency and consistency eventually forced Imperial Command to acknowledge that something was fundamentally wrong with the 8th Legion's recruitment and training processes. The situation reached a critical point when Curze himself returned to Nostramo to investigate reports of the planet's deteriorating condition. What he found was a world that had not only returned to its original state of criminal anarchy, but had actually surpassed it in terms of corruption and brutality. The criminal organizations that now controlled the planet had incorporated the Night Haunter's own methods into their operations, creating a society where terror was used not as a tool of justice, but as an instrument of pure oppression. Curze's reaction to discovering his homeworld's condition revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration and his growing disconnection from any coherent moral framework. Rather than attempting to restore order through the same methods he had used before, the Primarch concluded that Nostramo was beyond redemption and represented a fundamental threat to the integrity of his Legion. The world that had shaped him had become a source of corruption that was poisoning the very gene seed of his sons, turning them into monsters that served no purpose beyond their own gratification. The decision to destroy Nostramo was made with characteristic ruthlessness, as Curze concluded that the complete elimination of his homeworld was the only way to prevent its continued corruption of the Night Lord's Legion. The Primarch ordered his fleet to conduct orbital bombardment of the planet's major population centers, systematically destroying the hive cities and industrial complexes that had defined Nostraman civilization for millennia. It was an act of self-mutilation, the destruction of his own origin, driven by the same absolutist logic that had defined his entire existence. The bombardment of Nostramo was conducted with clinical precision, as the Night Lords used their intimate knowledge of the planet's geography and infrastructure to maximize the destruction. Cyclonic torpedoes were targeted at the major hive cities, while lance strikes eliminated smaller settlements and industrial facilities. The operation continued for several days, until the planet's surface was reduced to a lifeless wasteland of radioactive glass and twisted metal. Billions died, including many who had committed no crime beyond being born on a cursed world. The destruction of Nostramo sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium, as news of a Primarch destroying his own homeworld raised unprecedented questions about the loyalty and stability of the Space Marine legions. The official explanation presented to Imperial authorities described the action as a necessary response to widespread corruption and rebellion on the planet, but many within the Imperial hierarchy suspected that deeper issues were involved. Some whispered that Curze had destroyed the evidence of his own failure, eliminating the proof that his methods create only temporary compliance rather than lasting order. The psychological impact of destroying Nostramo on Curze himself was profound, as the action represented the final severing of his connection to any form of moral authority or justification for his methods. The Primarch had destroyed the world that created him, acknowledging that his own origins were fundamentally corrupted, while simultaneously eliminating any possibility of redemption or return to his earlier ideals. The Night Haunter had consumed Konrad Curze entirely, leaving only a creature of pure vengeance and terror, whose actions served no purpose beyond the infliction of suffering. Yet even this act of ultimate destruction failed to solve the fundamental problems plaguing the Night Lords. If anything, it accelerated their descent into darkness, as the Legion was now untethered from even the corrupted idealism that had once motivated their Primarch. The destruction of Nostramo marked a fundamental turning point in Konrad Curze's relationship with the Imperium, transforming what had been philosophical disagreements about methods into an irreconcilable breach with the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. The Primarch's decision to obliterate his homeworld demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that shocked even his most hardened supporters within the imperial hierarchy. But more importantly, it revealed the extent to which his moral compass had become completely divorced from any recognizable standard of justice or necessity. The official reports that reached Terra described the action as a regrettable but necessary response to widespread corruption. Yet those who knew Curze personally understood that something far more disturbing had occurred beneath the surface of this brutal calculus. The Emperor's reaction to the destruction of Nostramo was notably restrained, consisting primarily of administrative inquiries about the tactical necessity of such extreme measures, rather than any direct condemnation of his son's actions. This apparent indifference to the fate of an entire world and its billions of inhabitants served to reinforce Curze's growing belief that the Imperium's proclaimed dedication to protecting humanity was nothing more than propaganda designed to mask its true nature as a tyrannical empire built on violence and oppression. The Night Haunter began to see his own methods not as aberrations from imperial doctrine, but as honest expressions of the Imperium's fundamental character. Where other Primarchs cloaked their brutality in noble rhetoric about duty and necessity, Curze embraced the honest acknowledgement that power flowed from fear, and that order could only be maintained through the constant threat of overwhelming violence. This realization transformed his relationship with his brothers, as he could no longer tolerate what he saw as their hypocrisy and self-deception. The philosophical crisis that had been building within Curze's fractured psyche reached a critical mass as he struggled to reconcile his role as an instrument of imperial justice with his growing awareness of the Imperium's own moral bankruptcy. The visions that continued to plague his dreams showed him scenes of the Emperor's own brutality during the Unification Wars, the systematic extermination of entire populations who refused to accept imperial rule, the countless atrocities committed in the name of bringing order to the galaxy, the cold calculations that weighed billions of lives against strategic objectives. These revelations forced Curze to confront the uncomfortable truth that his own methods were not unique aberrations, but logical extensions of imperial policy. The Primarch's growing disillusionment was compounded by his observations of how other imperial institutions operated when they believed themselves unobserved. The Administratum's willingness to sacrifice entire worlds for marginal strategic advantages, the Mechanicum's callous experimentation on human subjects, and the Imperial Army's routine use of penal legions as expendable shock troops all served to validate Curze's belief that the Imperium's noble rhetoric masked a reality every bit as brutal as anything he had witnessed on Nostramo. The only difference, he concluded, was that the Imperium's violence was sanctified by official approval and dressed in the language of necessity and duty. This realization transformed Curze's relationship with his fellow Primarchs, as he began to view their criticism of his methods as either naive self-deception or deliberate hypocrisy. When Guilliman spoke of the need to minimize civilian casualties, Curze saw only willful blindness to the millions of civilians who died in Ultramarines' compliance campaigns through starvation, disease, and economic collapse. When Dorn emphasized the importance of protecting the innocent, the Night Haunter remembered the orbital bombardments that the Imperial Fists had conducted against rebellious Hive cities, killing indiscriminately. In the name of restoring order, the Primarch's arguments during War Council meetings became increasingly confrontational as he challenged his brothers to acknowledge the true nature of their actions and abandon what he saw as their hypocritical moral posturing. Curze would present detailed analyses of casualty figures from various compliance campaigns, demonstrating that conventional Imperial tactics often resulted in higher overall death tolls than his own terror operations. His logic was unassailable from a purely statistical perspective, but it ignored the qualitative differences between deaths caused by the necessities of warfare and those inflicted through deliberate torture and psychological manipulation. These confrontations served to further isolate the Night Lords within the broader Imperial military structure, as other Primarchs began to view Curze not merely as a useful but distasteful ally, but as a fundamental threat to the moral foundation of the Great Crusade. The philosophical poison that had consumed the 8th Legion's Primarch was beginning to spread through his arguments and challenges, forcing other commanders to confront uncomfortable questions about their own methods and motivations that they preferred to leave unexamined. The recruitment policies that Curze implemented following Nostramo's destruction reflected his complete abandonment of any pretense that the Night Lords served a noble purpose. With his homeworld eliminated as a source of new warriors, the Primarch turned to the criminal underworlds of compliant Imperial worlds, actively seeking out murderers, torturers, and other violent criminals to fill his legion's ranks. This represented a fundamental departure from standard Space Marine recruitment practices, which emphasized the selection of candidates who displayed not only physical prowess, but also moral character and psychological stability. The process of identifying suitable candidates involved extensive collaboration with local law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations, as Night Lords recruitment teams sought individuals who had demonstrated both the capacity for extreme violence and the psychological flexibility necessary to thrive in the Legion's increasingly corrupt culture. Planetary governors were pressured to provide access to their prison systems and execution facilities, where Night Lords' apothecaries would evaluate condemned criminals for potential recruitment into the 8th Legion. These new recruits brought with them cultural practices and moral frameworks that were fundamentally incompatible with traditional Space Marine values, accelerating the corruption that was already spreading through the Night Lords' ranks. Unlike the Nostraman criminals who had at least grown up in a society where violence served some form of social function, however twisted, these new candidates often came from backgrounds where cruelty and sadism were pursued for their own sake, rather than as tools for achieving specific objectives. The gene seed implantation process itself began to reflect these changes, as the Legion's apothecaries reported increasing rates of psychological instability and violent episodes among newly created Space Marines. Whether these problems resulted from the poor quality of the recruitment pool or represented some form of genetic degradation within the Night Lord's gene seed remained unclear. But the practical effect was the creation of warriors who were increasingly difficult to control and direct toward productive military objectives. Training programs within the Legion were modified to accommodate these new realities, with traditional instruction in Imperial doctrine and Space Marine values replaced by more practical courses in intimidation, torture techniques, and psychological manipulation. The Night Lords developed their own internal academies, where experienced veterans would pass on their knowledge of terror tactics to newly recruited Marines, creating a formal educational structure dedicated to the systematic study of cruelty and fear. These training facilities were established on worlds throughout the Night Lord's operational area, often housed within existing Imperial installations, where their activities could be concealed from outside observation. The curriculum included detailed instruction in anatomy and physiology to maximize the effectiveness of torture techniques, psychological profiling to identify individual fears and vulnerabilities, and communications technology to broadcast terror operations across entire star systems. The graduation ceremonies for these training programs involved practical examinations where newly trained Night Lords would demonstrate their mastery of terror techniques on captured prisoners or condemned criminals provided by local authorities. These exercises served both as assessments of technical competency and as initiation rituals that bound the participants together through shared complicity in Single. Why heinous acts? New recruits who showed hesitation or mercy were subjected to the same fates as their victims, ensuring that only the most callous and brutal survived to join the Legion's operational units. The cultural transformation of the Night Lords accelerated as these new recruitment and training practices took effect, creating a Legion that bore little resemblance to the organization that had originally served during the early years of the Great Crusade. Veterans who remembered the Legion's earlier incarnation found themselves increasingly outnumbered by younger Marines, who had never known any other way of warfare than the systematic application of terror and brutality. This generational divide created tensions within the Legion's command structure, as older officers struggled to maintain discipline and tactical coherence among subordinates who viewed traditional military objectives as secondary to their personal gratification. The Night Lords began to experience problems with unit cohesion and mission focus that had never existed during their earlier campaigns, as individual Marines and entire squads would abandon assigned objectives to pursue opportunities for torture and murder. Compliance operations that should have taken days stretched into weeks as Night Lords' forces became distracted by the opportunities for cruelty that conquered populations presented. The Legion was devouring itself from within, transforming from a military force into something more akin to a collection of predators wearing the trappings of organization. The situation was further complicated by the emergence of informal hierarchies within the Legion based on reputation for cruelty, rather than military competence or tactical skill. Marines who had achieved notoriety for particularly inventive forms of torture or psychological manipulation found themselves elevated to positions of influence regardless of their ability to command troops or plan military operations. This meritocracy of sadism gradually undermined the Legion's effectiveness as a military force, while reinforcing the cultural values that were driving their moral decay. Curze's response to these developments revealed the extent to which his own priorities had shifted away from military effectiveness toward the pursuit of terror as an end in itself. Rather than attempting to restore discipline and focus within his Legion, the Primarch embraced the chaos and encouraged his subordinates to explore ever more extreme forms of violence and intimidation. The Night Haunter had concluded that conventional military objectives were ultimately meaningless in the face of the galaxy's inevitable descent into chaos and civil war, making the cultivation of fear and despair more important than tactical victories or strategic gains. The visions that continued to torment him showed a future where the Imperium would tear itself apart, where brother would fight brother in a conflict that would consume the galaxy in flames. If that future was inevitable, and Curze had come to believe it was, then what purpose did military discipline serve? What value had tactical efficiency when the ultimate outcome was predetermined? Better to embrace the darkness completely, to become the monster that his visions showed him he was destined to be, than to cling to the illusion that his actions mattered or that his choices could alter the course of fate. The first tentative contacts between the Night Lords and Horus Lupercal occurred during joint operations in the Istvan system, where both legions had been deployed to suppress a rebellion that had spread across multiple worlds. The initial cooperation between the two forces proceeded smoothly, with the Luna Wolves providing conventional military pressure, while the Night Lords conducted their characteristic terror operations against rebel strongholds. However, the true significance of this collaboration lay not in its tactical success, but in the philosophical discussions that took place between the two Primarchs during planning sessions. Horus demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the Night Lords' methods and their psychological foundations, showing none of the moral squeamishness or tactical criticism that characterized other Primarchs' reactions to Curze's approach to warfare. The War Master spoke approvingly of the efficiency and effectiveness of terror tactics, while expressing frustration with what he described as the naive idealism that prevented other Imperial forces from adopting similarly practical approaches to military problems. These conversations revealed a fundamental compatibility between Horus and Curze that went beyond simple tactical cooperation to encompass shared views about the nature of power and the requirements for maintaining control over vast territories and diverse populations. Both Primarchs had concluded that the Imperium's official rhetoric about liberation and enlightenment was ultimately counterproductive, creating unrealistic expectations among subject populations, while constraining Imperial forces from using the most effective methods available to them. The philosophical alignment between the two Primarchs was reinforced by their shared frustration with the Emperor's increasingly distant leadership style, and his apparent indifference to the practical challenges faced by his sons during the Great Crusade. Horus spoke of feeling abandoned by their father, forced to make increasingly difficult decisions without guidance or support from the being who had created them to serve his vision. Curze found these complaints resonated strongly with his own experiences, particularly his failed attempts to warn the Emperor about the visions of betrayal and civil war that continued to plague his dreams. The growing relationship between Horus and Curze was facilitated by their mutual recognition that they were both products of worlds that had taught them harsh lessons about the nature of power and the requirements for survival in hostile environments. Cethonia's gang culture and Nostramo's criminal underworld had produced Primarchs who understood that strength alone was insufficient without the will to use it ruthlessly and without hesitation. This shared background created a bond between them that transcended the formal hierarchies of Imperial command structure. The War Master's influence on Curze was subtle but profound, as Horus possessed the rhetorical skills and political sophistication necessary to articulate the philosophical justifications that the Night Haunter had struggled to express coherently. Where Curze's arguments had been dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind, Horus presented similar ideas with the authority and credibility that came from his position as the Emperor's chosen successor, and his reputation as the most successful of all the Primarchs. Under Horus's guidance, Curze began to see his visions of future betrayal and civil war not as inevitable tragedies to be prevented, but as opportunities to reshape the Imperium according to more realistic principles. The War Master argued that the coming conflict would serve as a crucible that would burn away the Imperium's hypocritical idealism and reveal the brutal necessities that actually governed galactic civilization. Those who survived this test would be stronger and more honest about their methods, while those who clung to naive notions of honor and mercy would be eliminated as evolutionary dead ends. This reframing of the prophetic visions that had tormented Curze for decades provided him with a sense of purpose and direction that he had not experienced since his early years on Nostramo. Rather than being a passive observer of inevitable catastrophe, he could become an active participant in shaping the future according to principles that he understood and embraced. The Night Haunter's role in the coming Civil War would not be that of a reluctant traitor driven by circumstance, but of a conscious architect of a new order built on the honest acknowledgement of power's true nature. The recruitment of other Primarchs to Horus's cause proceeded gradually, with the War Master carefully identifying those brothers who shared similar frustrations with Imperial doctrine, or who possessed personalities that made them susceptible to his arguments. Curze served as an important ally in this process, as his reputation for brutal honesty and his willingness to voice criticisms that others kept to themselves made him a valuable sounding board for testing revolutionary ideas and identifying potential converts. The Night Lord's participation in the developing conspiracy was initially limited to intelligence gathering and psychological operations designed to undermine loyalty to the Emperor among other legions. Curze's intimate knowledge of his brother's personalities and psychological vulnerabilities made him particularly effective at identifying pressure points that could be exploited to drive wedges between loyalist forces. The techniques that the Night Lords had perfected for breaking enemy morale proved equally effective when applied to the task of corrupting imperial institutions from within. The decision to openly rebel against the Emperor was not made lightly. Despite Curze's growing conviction that such a conflict was inevitable, the Primarch understood that once the line was crossed, there would be no possibility of retreat or reconciliation, making it essential that the rebellion possessed sufficient strength and support to achieve decisive victory. The Night Lord's commitment to the cause was therefore conditional on Horus's ability to demonstrate that the loyalist forces could be defeated, and that the new order they sought to create would actually be achievable. The planning for what would become known as the Istvan V drop site massacre represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and coordination between the traitor legions. The operation was designed to eliminate the loyalist forces that posed the greatest threat to the rebellion, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of continued resistance to the Emperor's remaining supporters. The Night Lords were assigned a crucial role in the massacre, tasked with ensuring that no loyalist survivors would escape to carry word of the betrayal back to Terra. The psychological preparation for this ultimate act of treachery required extensive conditioning of the Night Lord's rank and file, many of whom retained some vestige of loyalty to the Imperium despite their corruption. Curze and his senior officers conducted intensive indoctrination sessions designed to convince their subordinates that the Emperor had always been their true enemy, and that their previous service had been based on lies and deception. The Primarch drew upon his extensive catalog of imperial atrocities and hypocrisies to demonstrate that the rebellion represented not a betrayal of their oaths, but a liberation from false promises and impossible ideals. The purging of loyalist elements within the Night Lord's own ranks proceeded with characteristic thoroughness, as Curze identified and eliminated any Marines who showed signs of wavering commitment to the rebellion. These internal executions were conducted publicly and with elaborate ceremony, serving both to remove potential threats and to reinforce the message that there could be no neutrality in the coming conflict. The methods employed were designed to maximize the psychological impact on survivors, ensuring that any remaining doubts about the wisdom of rebellion would be suppressed by fear of similar treatment. The transformation of the Night Lords from imperial servants to active traitors was completed through their participation in the drop site massacre itself, as the act of murdering their brother legionaries severed any remaining bonds of loyalty or sentiment that might have connected them to their former allegiances. The massacre was not simply a military operation, but a ritual of corruption that bound all participants together through shared guilt and complicity, in an act that could never be forgiven or forgotten. The betrayal at Istvan V had shattered the galaxy's illusions about the Space Marine Legion's absolute loyalty, but the true scope of the heresy's devastation would only become apparent as the traitor forces dispersed across the galaxy to pursue their individual objectives. While Horus marshaled his primary forces for the drive toward Terra, Konrad Curze received orders that aligned perfectly with his own twisted sense of justice and his desire to prove the superiority of his methods over those of his more idealistic brothers. The Night Lords were tasked with preventing loyalist reinforcements from reaching the throne world by conducting a campaign of terror and destruction across the Eastern Fringe, a mission that would bring them into direct conflict with one of the Imperium's most disciplined and secretive legions. The Dark Angels Legion, under the command of Lion Eljanson, represented everything that Curze had come to despise about the Imperium's hypocritical nature. The First Legion's reputation for unwavering loyalty and their Primarch's status as one of the Emperor's most trusted sons made them a priority target for elimination. But more importantly, they embodied the kind of rigid moral certainty that the Night Haunter viewed as both naive and dangerous. Lion Eljanson's refusal to acknowledge the brutal realities that governed galactic civilization made him the perfect opponent for demonstrating the futility of honor and nobility in the face of determined ruthlessness. This would not be merely a military campaign, but a philosophical argument conducted through violence, a proof written in blood that terror was superior to honor, that fear was more reliable than loyalty, and that the Night Haunter's vision of the galaxy was more honest than the Lion's noble delusions. The strategic situation in the Eastern Fringe during the early years of the heresy was complex and fluid, with loyalist and traitor forces scattered across dozens of star systems, as both sides struggled to consolidate their positions and secure vital resources. The Dark Angels had been conducting compliance operations in the region when news of Horus's betrayal reached them, forcing Lion Eljanson to make rapid decisions about how to respond to the crisis, while simultaneously maintaining control over the territories under his command. Curze's initial assessment of the tactical situation revealed several key advantages that the Night Lords could exploit in their campaign against the Dark Angels. The First Legion's forces were dispersed across multiple star systems, making it difficult for them to concentrate their strength against a single threat. Their commitment to protecting civilian populations and maintaining order in compliant territories created additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Through terror tactics designed to force the Dark Angels into defensive positions. Most importantly, Lion Eljanson's predictable adherence to conventional military doctrine made his responses to Night Lords' operations relatively easy to anticipate and counter. The opening phase of what would become known as the Thramas Crusade began with a series of coordinated strikes against Dark Angel supply lines and communication networks throughout the Eastern Fringe. Night Lords' assault teams equipped with jump packs and specialized demolition charges targeted fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, and astropathic relay stations that were essential for maintaining the First Legion's operational capacity. These attacks were conducted with characteristic brutality, as captured Dark Angels personnel were subjected to elaborate torture sessions designed to extract intelligence while simultaneously serving as psychological weapons against their comrades. The Night Lords' approach to intelligence gathering during this campaign reflected their complete abandonment of any pretense of following imperial protocols for the treatment of prisoners. Captured Dark Angels were transported to specialized interrogation facilities established on barren worlds throughout the region, where teams of Night Lords, apothecaries, and torture specialists would spend days or weeks extracting every piece of useful information from their victims before finally granting them the release of death. These interrogation sessions were conducted with scientific precision, as the Night Lords had developed sophisticated techniques for breaking down the psychological defenses that Space Marine conditioning provided against conventional torture methods. The process began with careful analysis of each prisoner's personal history and psychological profile, identifying specific fears, loyalties, and emotional attachments that could be exploited. Physical torture was then combined with psychological manipulation, designed to systematically destroy the victim's sense of identity and purpose, reducing proud Space Marines to broken shells who would reveal anything their captors wished to know. The intelligence gathered through these brutal methods provided the Night Lords with detailed information about Dark Angels' force deployments, supply routes, and command structures that proved invaluable for planning subsequent operations. More importantly, the systematic torture of captured Dark Angels served as a weapon of psychological warfare that gradually eroded the First Legion's morale and combat effectiveness. As word of their comrades' fates spread through their ranks, Dark Angels warriors found themselves fighting not only against a tactical enemy, but against their own growing fear of capture. Lion L. Johnson's initial response to the Night Lords' campaign demonstrated both his tactical competence and his fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy he faced. The Dark Angels Primarch attempted to counter the terror attacks through conventional military means, deploying rapid response forces to protect key installations while conducting sweeps of suspected Night Lord strongholds. These operations achieved limited tactical success, but failed to address the underlying strategic problem posed by an enemy who refused to fight according to established rules of engagement. The Dark Angels' adherence to traditional Space Marine combat doctrines proved to be a significant disadvantage when facing an opponent who had completely abandoned such constraints. Lion L. Johnson's forces were trained and equipped for direct confrontation with enemy military units, not for the kind of asymmetric warfare that the Night Lords specialized in conducting. The First Legion's attempts to protect civilian populations and maintain order in compliant territories created additional burdens that the Night Lords exploited ruthlessly, forcing the Dark Angels to spread their forces thin while providing numerous soft targets for terror operations. The first major engagement of the Thramas Crusade occurred in the Sheol system, where a Dark Angel strike force had been deployed to investigate reports of Night Lords' activity on the system's industrial worlds. The Dark Angels force consisted of approximately 3 companies of Space Marines supported by Imperial Army units and a small fleet of escort vessels, a substantial force that should have been more than adequate to deal with the reported Night Lords' presence in the system. The Night Lords' preparation for the Battle of Sheol demonstrated their evolution from a conventional Space Marine legion into something far more sinister and effective. Rather than attempting to match the Dark Angels in direct combat, Curze's forces had spent weeks infiltrating the system's civilian infrastructure and establishing hidden bases within the industrial complexes that dotted the system's inhabited worlds. When the Dark Angels arrived, they found themselves facing not a conventional military force, but a distributed network of terror cells that could strike from any direction at any time. The opening phase of the battle involved simultaneous attacks on the Dark Angels' landing zones, supply depots, and command facilities, conducted by Night Lords assault teams that emerged from concealed positions throughout the industrial complexes. These initial strikes were designed not to achieve decisive tactical victories, but to create confusion and disrupt the Dark Angels' ability to coordinate their response to the broader threat. Jump pack-equipped Night Lords would appear without warning to conduct brief, but devastating attacks on isolated units, before vanishing back into the maze of industrial structures that provided perfect concealment for their operations. The psychological impact of these hit-and-run attacks was amplified by the Night Lord's systematic targeting of Dark Angels officers and communication specialists, gradually degrading the First Legion's command and control capabilities, while creating an atmosphere of constant tension and uncertainty. Dark Angels squads found themselves operating in isolation, unable to establish reliable contact with their commanders or coordinate their actions with nearby units. The industrial environment that should have provided defensive advantages instead became a labyrinth of potential ambush sites where death could strike from any shadow. The Dark Angels' attempts to establish secure perimeters and conduct systematic sweeps of the industrial complexes were frustrated by the Night Lords' intimate knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to use the civilian population as both shields and weapons. Night Lords operatives had spent weeks terrorizing the local workforce into compliance, creating a network of informants and collaborators who provided intelligence about Dark Angels' movements, while simultaneously serving as human obstacles that the First Legion could not simply eliminate without violating their own moral code. The climax of the Battle of Sheol occurred when Night Lords' forces managed to capture several Dark Angels officers during a failed assault on what appeared to be a major Night Lord stronghold, but was actually an elaborate trap designed to lure the First Legion's commanders into a carefully prepared killing ground. The captured officers were subjected to public torture sessions that were broadcast throughout the system, serving both as sources of tactical intelligence and as psychological weapons designed to break the morale of the remaining Dark Angels forces. The sight of their brothers being systematically brutalized had a profound impact on the Dark Angel survivors, who found themselves torn between their desire to rescue their comrades and their recognition that any rescue attempt would likely result in additional casualties. The Night Lords exploited this psychological pressure by offering to exchange prisoners for strategic concessions, creating moral dilemmas that the Dark Angels were ill-equipped to resolve, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about their tactical doctrines and decision-making processes. The eventual withdrawal of Dark Angels' forces from the Sheol system marked the first clear victory for the Night Lords in the Thramas Crusade, but more importantly, it established the pattern of warfare that would characterize the entire campaign. The Night Lords had demonstrated that conventional Space Marine tactics were inadequate for dealing with an enemy who refused to fight according to established rules, while the Dark Angels had learned that their commitment to protecting civilian populations and maintaining moral standards created vulnerabilities that could be ruthlessly exploited. The void warfare that developed during the middle phases of the Thramas Crusade represented a significant evolution in Night Lords' tactical doctrine, as they adapted their terror-based approach to the unique challenges of naval combat. Traditional space, Marine fleet engagements emphasized direct confrontation between capital ships, with victory achieved through superior firepower and tactical maneuvering. The Night Lords instead developed an approach that combined conventional naval tactics with psychological warfare, designed to break enemy morale before decisive combat even began. Night Lords' fleet operations during the Thramas Crusade were characterized by the systematic use of captured vessels as weapons of psychological warfare. Ships taken from defeated Dark Angels forces were converted into floating monuments to terror, with their hulls decorated with the flayed remains of their former crews and their communication systems used to broadcast recordings of torture sessions to nearby enemy vessels. These nightmare ships would appear on the periphery of Dark Angel's formations, serving as constant reminders of the fate that awaited those who continued to resist. The technical modifications made to Night Lord's V.S. cells reflected their complete abandonment of conventional space marine values and their embrace of terror as their primary weapon. Ship interiors were redesigned to accommodate torture chambers and execution facilities that could be used to break captured enemy personnel, while simultaneously serving as training grounds for newly recruited Night Lords. The ship's external appearance was modified with grotesque decorations and trophies taken from defeated enemies, creating vessels that inspired fear and revulsion in all who encountered them. The Battle of Thramas itself represented the largest single engagement of the campaign, as both sides committed substantial fleet assets to what they hoped would be a decisive confrontation. The Dark Angels assembled a force of over 50 capital ships supported by numerous escort vessels and strike cruisers, while the Night Lords deployed a somewhat smaller but more specialized fleet that had been modified specifically for their preferred style of warfare. The opening phases of the battle proceeded according to conventional patterns, with both fleets maneuvering for tactical advantage, while conducting long-range bombardments designed to weaken enemy formations before the decisive close-range engagement. However, the Night Lords' true strategy became apparent when they began broadcasting live feeds from their torture chambers, showing captured Dark Angels personnel being systematically brutalized, while their comrades watched helplessly from nearby vessels. The psychological pressure created by these broadcasts was compounded by the Night Lord's use of specialized ammunition, designed to create maximum suffering among enemy crews. Boarding torpedoes filled with toxins that caused paralysis rather than death allowed Night Lords' assault teams to capture enemy personnel alive for transport back to their torture facilities. The knowledge that capture meant prolonged agony rather than honorable death in battle had a profound impact on Dark Angel's morale, creating hesitation and fear that the Night Lords exploited ruthlessly. The climax of the Battle of Thramas occurred when Night Lords boarding parties managed to capture Lion El'Jonson himself during what appeared to be a successful Dark Angels assault on the Night Lords' flagship. The Dark Angels Primarch had led a teleporter assault on Curze's command vessel, expecting to end the campaign through a decisive strike against the enemy leadership. Instead, he found himself trapped in a carefully prepared ambush that had been designed specifically to capture him alive, rather than simply eliminate him as a threat. The capture of Lion El'Jonson represented the greatest victory of Curze's military career, providing him with the ultimate prize for his campaign of terror, while simultaneously demonstrating the superiority of his methods over conventional space marine tactics. The Dark Angels Primarch's presence aboard the Night Lord's flagship created opportunities for psychological warfare that went far beyond anything the 8th Legion had previously attempted, as Curze now possessed the means to break not just individual Dark Angels, but the entire Legion's will to continue fighting. The interrogation of Lion El'Jonson was conducted by Curze personally, representing both a professional challenge and a deeply personal opportunity to vindicate his philosophy through the systematic breaking of one of the Imperium's most celebrated heroes. The Night Haunter approached this task with characteristic thoroughness, studying his prisoner's psychological profile and personal history to identify the specific techniques that would prove most effective against his particular combination of pride, duty, and moral certainty. The psychological warfare conducted against the captured Primarch was designed not simply to extract information, but to fundamentally alter his understanding of himself and his role in the galaxy. Curze subjected Lion El'Jonson to extended philosophical discussions about the nature of justice and the requirements for maintaining order, using carefully selected examples from imperial history to demonstrate the hypocrisy and brutality that characterized the regime they both served. These conversations were interspersed with displays of the suffering that the Dark Angels' continued resistance was causing among their own personnel, creating moral pressure designed to break down the Primarch's psychological defenses. The techniques employed during these sessions reflected Curze's sophisticated understanding of psychology and his intimate knowledge of his brother's personality and motivations. Rather than relying on physical torture, which would likely prove ineffective against a Primarch's enhanced physiology, the Night Haunter focused on psychological manipulation designed to create doubt and self-recrimination. He presented carefully edited recordings of Dark Angels' operations that emphasized civilian casualties and collateral damage, arguing that Lion El'Jonson's adherence to conventional moral standards had actually resulted in more suffering than the Night Lord's more direct approach. The intellectual component of these interrogation sessions was perhaps their most disturbing aspect, as Curze demonstrated a genuine desire to convert his brother to his own worldview rather than simply breaking him for tactical advantage. The Night Haunter's arguments were logically constructed and supported by extensive evidence, making them far more dangerous than simple threats or physical coercion. He presented a coherent philosophical framework that justified extreme measures as necessary responses to an inherently hostile universe, offering Lion El'Jonson a way to rationalize abandoning his moral principles without admitting that he had been fundamentally wrong about the nature of justice and duty. The psychological pressure created by these sessions was amplified by Curze's use of his prophetic vision to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. The Night Haunter shared carefully selected glimpses of possible futures that showed the Dark Angels' eventual defeat and the suffering that their continued fighting would cause among Imperial civilians. These visions were presented not as inevitable outcomes, but as consequences of Lion El'Jonson's refusal to accept the reality of the Imperium's true nature and adapt his methods accordingly. The duration of Lion El'Jonson's captivity allowed Curze to conduct an extended campaign of psychological warfare that went far beyond anything attempted during previous Night Lord's operations. The interrogation sessions continued for weeks, with the Night Haunter gradually escalating the psychological pressure while carefully monitoring his prisoners' responses for signs of weakening resolve. The process was conducted with scientific precision, as Curze documented each technique's effectiveness and adjusted his approach based on the results achieved. The impact of the Dark Angels' Primarch's capture on the broader campaign was immediate and devastating. As news of their Gene Father's fate spread through the First Legion's remaining forces, the psychological shock of learning that their seemingly invincible leader had been taken prisoner created panic and confusion that the Night Lords exploited ruthlessly, conducting coordinated attacks against demoralized Dark Angels' positions throughout the eastern fringe. The rescue attempt that eventually freed Lion El'Jonson was conducted by a joint force of Dark Angels and loyalist elements from other legions who had managed to coordinate their efforts, despite the communication difficulties created by the Night Lord's systematic targeting of astropathic facilities. The operation required extensive planning and coordination, as the rescuers had to overcome not only the Night Lord's defensive preparations, but also the psychological warfare techniques that had been employed to break their Primarch's spirit. The assault on the Night Lord's flagship was conducted with desperate determination, as the Dark Angels understood that their legion's survival depended on successfully retrieving their Gene Father before his captivity, could be used to achieve the complete demoralization of their remaining forces. The boarding action that followed was among the most brutal engagements of the entire heresy, as Dark Angel's assault teams fought through corridors that had been deliberately designed to maximize the psychological impact of the horrors they contained. The eventual escape of Lion L. Johnson marked the end of the most successful phase of the Night Lord's campaign, but the psychological damage inflicted during his captivity would have lasting consequences for both Primarchs and their respective legions. The Dark Angel's Primarch had been exposed to philosophical arguments and moral challenges that would continue to influence his thinking long after his physical liberation, while Curze had demonstrated the effectiveness of his methods against even the most disciplined and morally certain of his brothers. The final phases of the Thramas Crusade devolved into a series of increasingly desperate engagements, as both legions found themselves severely weakened by the prolonged campaign. The Night Lords had achieved their strategic objective of preventing Dark Angel's reinforcements from reaching Terra, but the cost had been enormous in terms of both personnel and materiel. The systematic use of terror tactics had proven effective against conventional opponents, but the Dark Angel's stubborn resistance and their willingness to accept heavy casualties in pursuit of their objectives had forced the Night Lords to engage in the kind of prolonged conventional warfare that they were ill-equipped to sustain. The mutual exhaustion that characterized the campaign's conclusion left both legions as shadows of their former strength, with neither side capable of achieving decisive victory over the odd. The Dark Angels had maintained their moral integrity and their loyalty to the Emperor, but at a cost that would influence their character and methods for millennia to come. The Night Lords had proven the effectiveness of their terror-based approach to warfare, but had also demonstrated its limitations when faced with opponents who possessed the discipline and determination necessary to endure prolonged psychological pressure. The devastation wrought during the Thramas Crusade had left the Night Lords scattered across the eastern fringe like the fragments of a shattered blade. Their strength bled away through years of brutal warfare against the Dark Angels and their allies. As Horus marshaled his forces for the final assault on Terra, consolidating the might of 4 traitor legions and their supporting elements into the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen, Konrad Curze found himself commanding a legion that existed more in name than in substance. The 8th Legion's companies were dispersed across dozens of star systems, some reduced to mere squads of survivors clinging to existence in the void between worlds, others transformed into roving bands of pirates and murderers who retained little connection to their original military purpose. The strategic implications of the Night Lord's absence from the siege of Terra would only become apparent in hindsight, as military historians attempted to calculate how different the outcome might have been if Curze's forces had been available to supplement Horus's assault. The Night Lord's specialization in terror tactics and psychological warfare could have proven decisive in breaking the morale of Terra's defenders, particularly given their expertise in urban warfare and their complete disregard for civilian casualties. The systematic application of their methods against Terra's civilian population might have created the kind of panic and despair that would have undermined the Imperial defenders' will to continue fighting, potentially shortening the siege by months or even years. However, the reality of the Night Lord's situation during the final years of the heresy made their participation in the climactic battle impossible. The Legion's scattered state was not merely a consequence of their losses during the Thramas Crusade, but reflected fundamental problems with unit cohesion and command structure that had been developing for decades. The recruitment of criminals and psychopaths from across the galaxy had created a force that was increasingly difficult to control and direct toward coherent military objectives, as individual Marines and entire companies pursued their own agendas rather than following orders from their superiors. The breakdown of traditional Space Marine discipline within the Night Lords had accelerated during the later phases of the Thramas Crusade, as the prolonged campaign stresses exposed the fundamental weaknesses in the Legion's organizational structure. Companies that had maintained some semblance of military order during the early years of the heresy began to fragment into smaller units led by whoever could command respect through violence and intimidation. These ad hoc formations operated more like pirate bands than military units, conducting raids and terror operations based on opportunities for personal gain rather than strategic necessity. Curze's attempts to reassert control over his dispersed forces were hampered by his own deteriorating mental condition and the practical difficulties of maintaining communication across the vast distances that separated Night Lords' formations. The Primarch's prophetic visions had become increasingly frequent and disturbing, showing him scenes of the Siege of Terra that emphasized his own absence from the climactic battle, while simultaneously revealing the ultimate futility of Horus's rebellion. These glimpses of possible futures created a paralyzing sense of inevitability that undermined his ability to make decisive command decisions or inspire his subordinates to greater efforts. The pursuit of the Night Lords by Loyalist forces during this period was coordinated primarily by Corax of the Raven Guard, whose legion possessed the stealth capabilities and mobility necessary to track down the scattered remnants of the 8th Legion across the eastern fringe. The 19th Legion's approach to this campaign differed significantly from the methodical warfare that had characterized the Thramas Crusade, as Corax understood that conventional tactics would be ineffective against an enemy that had abandoned traditional military organization in favor of guerrilla warfare and terrorism. The Raven Guard's pursuit operations were conducted with surgical precision, targeting Night Lords formations that had been identified through intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, rather than attempting to engage the enemy in large-scale battles that would favor the 8th Legion's preferred fighting style. Corax's forces would strike without warning against isolated Night Lords companies, using their superior mobility and coordination to achieve local superiority before withdrawing before enemy reinforcements could arrive. These hit-and-run attacks gradually wore down the Night Lords' strength, while denying them the opportunity to conduct the kind of terror operations that had proven so effective during their earlier campaigns. The psychological warfare that developed between the two legions during this period represented a fascinating study in contrasting approaches to unconventional combat. The Night Lords continued to rely on their traditional methods of intimidation and brutality, conducting increasingly desperate terror attacks against civilian populations in an attempt to force the Raven Guard to divert resources to protective duties. However, these operations were often poorly planned and executed, reflecting the breakdown in command structure that had left many Night Lords formations without effective leadership or clear objectives. The Raven Guard's response to these terror attacks demonstrated Corax's sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and psychological warfare. Rather than allowing his forces to be drawn into defensive operations that would play to the Night Lord's strengths, the Raven Guard Primarch focused on eliminating the sources of these attacks through targeted strikes against Night Lord's command elements and supply bases. This approach required extensive intelligence gathering and careful planning, but it proved far more effective than conventional protective measures in reducing the frequency and effectiveness of Night Lord's terror operations. The hunt for Konrad Curze himself became a personal obsession for Corax, who viewed the Night Lord's Primarch as a cancer that needed to be excised from the galaxy before his influence could spread further. The Raven Guard Primarch had witnessed firsthand the psychological damage that Curze's methods inflicted on both enemies and allies, and he understood that the Night Haunter's continued existence posed a threat that went beyond simple military considerations. The philosophical poison that had consumed the 8th Legion's Gene Father represented a fundamental challenge to the values and ideals that the Loyalist forces were fighting to preserve. The tracking of Curze across the eastern fringe required the Raven Guard to adapt their traditional stealth tactics to the unique challenges posed by hunting a Primarch, who possessed intimate knowledge of concealment and misdirection. Corax's forces had to rely on indirect methods of detection, analyzing patterns of terror attacks and civilian casualties to identify areas where the Night Lord's Primarch might be operating. This investigative approach was time-consuming and resource-intensive, but it gradually narrowed the search area and provided intelligence about Curze's psychological state and tactical preferences. The few direct encounters between Corax and Curze during this period were brief but intense affairs that revealed the extent to which both Primarchs had been changed by their experiences during the heresy. The Night Haunter had become increasingly erratic and unpredictable, his behavior alternating between periods of lucid tactical brilliance and episodes of seemingly random violence that served no apparent strategic purpose. These encounters typically occurred when Curze would emerge from hiding to conduct personal terror operations against civilian populations, only to vanish again when Raven Guard forces arrived to investigate. The psychological profile that Raven Guard intelligence specialists developed of Curze during this period painted a picture of a being whose sanity had been completely shattered by the weight of his prophetic visions and the accumulated guilt of his actions. The Night Lord's Primarch appeared to be driven by a compulsive need to validate his philosophy through increasingly extreme demonstrations of terror's effectiveness, even when such operations served no tactical purpose and actually made him easier to track and target. This self-destructive behavior suggested that Curze had abandoned any hope of survival and was instead focused on ensuring that his legacy of fear would outlast his physical destruction. The impact of the prolonged pursuit on the Night Lords as a whole was devastating, as the constant pressure from Raven Guard forces prevented them from consolidating their strength or conducting the kind of large-scale terror operations that had defined their earlier campaigns. Individual companies found themselves isolated and under constant threat, forced to expend their limited resources on basic survival rather than offensive operations. The psychological strain of being hunted by an enemy who possessed superior intelligence capabilities and mobility gradually eroded whatever remained of the Night Lord's unit cohesion and fighting spirit. The breakdown of communication between scattered Night Lords formations was exacerbated by the Raven Guard's systematic targeting of astropathic facilities and communication relays throughout the eastern fringe. This campaign of infrastructure destruction was designed to prevent the Night Lords from coordinating their activities or sharing intelligence about Raven Guard movements. But it also had the unintended consequence of accelerating the Legion's fragmentation into autonomous units that operated without reference to any central authority or strategic plan. The absence of the Night Lords from the Siege of Terra was felt most acutely during the early phases of the assault, when Horus's forces were attempting to establish beachheads on the planet's surface and break through the outer defensive lines. The specialized urban warfare techniques that the 8th Legion had perfected during their compliance campaigns could have proven invaluable for clearing the maze of fortifications and defensive positions that protected the approaches to the Imperial Palace. The Night Lords' willingness to use civilian populations as human shields and their expertise in conducting operations in heavily built-up areas might have allowed the traitor forces to advance more rapidly and with fewer casualties. The psychological warfare capabilities that the Night Lords possessed could have been equally valuable during the siege's later phases, when both sides were locked in brutal attritional warfare that tested the limits of human endurance. The systematic application of terror tactics against Terra's civilian population might have created the kind of mass panic and social breakdown that would have undermined the defenders' morale and forced them to divert resources from military operations to maintain civil order. The Night Lord's expertise in breaking enemy will, through psychological pressure, could have complemented the more conventional military approaches employed by the other traitor legions. However, the strategic benefits that the Night Lords might have provided during the Siege of Terra must be weighed against the potential problems that their presence would have created for Horus's overall campaign. The 8th Legion's lack of discipline and their tendency to pursue personal agendas rather than following orders had become increasingly problematic during the final years of the heresy, making them unreliable allies whose actions might have undermined the careful coordination required for such a complex military operation. The news of Horus's defeat and death reached the scattered Night Lords formations through a variety of channels, from astropathic communications to captured Imperial broadcasts, but the impact of this information varied significantly depending on each unit's particular circumstances and leadership. Some companies received the news with despair and resignation, recognizing that their cause had been lost and that they faced inevitable destruction at the hands of loyalist forces. Others responded with rage and defiance, vowing to continue their campaign of terror as a form of revenge against the Imperium that had destroyed their War Master and their dreams of a new order. The psychological impact of Horus's defeat on Konrad Curze was particularly severe, as the event validated the prophetic visions that had tormented him for decades, while simultaneously destroying any hope that the rebellion might succeed in its ultimate objectives. The Night Lord's Primarch had committed himself to the traitor cause partly because his visions had shown him that the conflict was inevitable, but he had also harbored a secret hope that victory might allow him to reshape the galaxy according to his own twisted vision of justice. The failure of the Siege of Terra eliminated this possibility and left him with nothing but the certainty of his own eventual destruction. The beginning of what would later be known as the Long War represented a fundamental transformation in the Night Lord's character and objectives, as they evolved from a military force serving a coherent political cause into something more akin to a collection of terrorist organizations united only by their shared hatred of the Imperium and their commitment to spreading fear and suffering throughout the galaxy. This transition was not immediate, but occurred gradually over the months and years following Horus's defeat, as individual Night Lords formations adapted to their new circumstances and developed their own interpretations of what their legion's mission should be in the post-heresy galaxy. The practical challenges faced by Night Lords formations during the early years of the Long War were enormous, as they found themselves cut off from the supply lines and support networks that had sustained them during the heresy. The Legion's scattered state made it impossible to coordinate large-scale operation or pool resources for major campaigns, forcing individual companies to become self-sufficient or face gradual attrition through combat losses and equipment failures. This isolation accelerated the transformation of Night Lords units into pirate bands and terror cells that operated more like criminal organizations than military formations. The recruitment practices that Night Lords formations adopted during this period reflected their desperate need for new personnel and their complete abandonment of traditional Space Marine selection criteria. Captured Imperial personnel were subjected to crude conversion processes that bore little resemblance to the careful gene seed implantation procedures employed by loyalist legions, creating warriors whose loyalty was based on fear rather than genuine commitment to the Legion's cause. These forced recruits often proved unreliable and required constant supervision to prevent them from deserting or betraying their new masters to Imperial authorities. The technological degradation that affected Night Lords' equipment during the Long War's early years was another significant challenge that forced the Legion to adapt their tactics and operational methods. The sophisticated weapons and vehicles that had made them such effective terror weapons during the Great Crusade and Heresy gradually broke down without access to proper maintenance facilities and replacement parts. This technological decline forced Night Lords' formations to rely increasingly on scavenged equipment and improvised weapons, reducing their military effectiveness, while simultaneously making them more dependent on terror tactics and psychological warfare. The fragmentation of the Night Lords into autonomous warbands was accelerated by the emergence of charismatic leaders who possessed the ruthlessness and tactical skill necessary to command respect among the Legion's increasingly undisciplined ranks. These warlords typically rose to power through violence and intimidation, establishing their authority by eliminating rivals and demonstrating their effectiveness as raiders and terrorists. The most successful of these leaders were able to attract followers from multiple Night Lords formations, creating larger organizations that could conduct more ambitious operations while maintaining the flexibility and independence that characterized post-heresy Night Lords' tactics. The evolution of Night Lords' operational methods during the Long War reflected their adaptation to a strategic environment that was fundamentally different from the one they had known during the heresy. The Legion's traditional approach to terror warfare had been designed for use against planetary governments and military formations that possessed fixed assets and clear command structures that could be targeted and eliminated. The post-heresy Imperium presented a more complex challenge, with multiple layers of authority and redundant systems that made it difficult to achieve decisive results through conventional terror operations. The development of new terror tactics during this period demonstrate the Night Lords' continued innovation and adaptation despite their reduced circumstances. Formations that had access to spacecraft began conducting hit-and-run raids against Imperial shipping lanes, capturing vessels and their crews for use in elaborate torture sessions that were broadcast across entire sectors as warnings to other potential victims. These operations served both practical and psychological purposes, providing the Night Lords with necessary supplies and equipment, while simultaneously spreading fear throughout Imperial space. The targeting of Imperial infrastructure became another important component of Night Lord strategy during the Long War, as they recognized that the Imperium's vast size and complexity made it vulnerable to systematic sabotage and disruption. Astropathic relay stations, fuel depots, and manufacturing facilities were attacked not for their immediate tactical value, but for their role in maintaining the complex logistical networks that held the Imperium together. These operations were designed to create cascading failures that would multiply the impact of individual attacks and demonstrate the futility of attempting to protect such a vast and complex civilization. The psychological warfare campaigns conducted by Night Lords formations during the Long War became increasingly sophisticated as they adapted their methods to exploit the specific fears and cultural taboos of their target populations. Intelligence gathering operations focused on identifying local superstitions, religious beliefs, and historical traumas that could be weaponized through carefully crafted propaganda and terror displays. These psychological operations were often more effective than direct military action in achieving the Night Lords' objectives of spreading fear and undermining Imperial authority. The systematic degradation of Imperial infrastructure throughout the Eastern Fringe had created a power vacuum that the scattered Night Lords' formations were uniquely positioned to exploit, but their inability to coordinate large-scale operations meant that these opportunities were often wasted on petty raids and meaningless acts of violence. As the Long War entered its second decade, Konrad Curze found himself commanding not a legion, but a collection of autonomous terror cells that acknowledged his authority only when it suited their immediate purposes. The Primarch's attempts to reassert centralized control over his dispersed forces were hampered by the practical impossibilities of communication across hostile space and the fundamental changes that had occurred within the Night Lord's command structure during their years of desperate survival. The establishment of Tsagualsa as Curze's primary base of operations represented an attempt to create a focal point around which the scattered remnants of the 8th Legion could coalesce. But the fortress monastery that his followers constructed on the Dead World bore little resemblance to the disciplined military installations that had once housed Space Marine forces. The complex was built from salvaged materials scavenged from dozens of battlefields, its architecture reflecting the twisted aesthetic sensibilities that had evolved within the Night Lords during their transformation from imperial servants to galactic pariahs. Corridors lined with the flayed remains of captured enemies led to chambers where torture had been elevated to an art form, while the central throne room was decorated with trophies taken from every major engagement the Legion had fought since the beginning of the heresy. The pilgrimage to Tsagualsa, undertaken by Night Lords formations from across the galaxy, served multiple purposes beyond simple military coordination. As individual warbands sought validation of their methods and confirmation that their actions served some greater purpose than mere survival. The fortress became a repository of terror techniques and psychological warfare innovations, where experienced practitioners could share their knowledge with newer recruits while competing to demonstrate their mastery of increasingly elaborate forms of cruelty. These gatherings were characterized by displays of brutality that served both as entertainment and as educational demonstrations, creating a culture where sadism was not merely tolerated, but actively celebrated as the highest expression of the Legion's values. Veterans would conduct live demonstrations of their techniques, using captured prisoners to illustrate the proper methods for breaking human minds and bodies. Younger Night Lords would compete to develop new innovations in terror, presenting their victims like artists displaying their work. The recruitment drives conducted from Tsagualsa during this period reflected Curze's growing desperation to rebuild his Legion's strength, but the quality of candidates available was far inferior to even the criminals and psychopaths who had joined the Night Lords during the later years of the Great Crusade. The fortress's dungeons were filled with captured Imperial personnel, who had been selected not for their physical capabilities or psychological suitability, but simply because they were available for conversion. The gene seed implantation procedures conducted on these unwilling subjects were crude and often fatal, resulting in a high failure rate that further depleted the Legion's already limited biological resources. The successful conversions that emerged from these brutal recruitment processes were fundamentally different from traditional Space Marines, lacking both the physical enhancements and psychological conditioning that had made the original Legion such effective military forces. These new Night Lords were driven primarily by fear of their masters rather than loyalty to any cause or ideology, making them unreliable in combat situations where independent judgment and initiative were required. The intelligence networks that the Night Lords established throughout the Eastern Fringe during this period were built on foundations of terror rather than genuine cooperation, as local populations provided information primarily to avoid becoming targets of Night Lords' reprisals rather than out of any sympathy for their cause. These networks were inherently unstable and prone to collapse when Imperial forces offered better protection, or when the fear that maintained them was overcome by anger or desperation. The technological innovations developed by Night Lords artificers during the Long War reflected their adaptation to resource scarcity and their increasing reliance on psychological warfare over conventional military tactics. Weapons were modified to maximize the suffering they inflicted rather than their battlefield effectiveness, with serrated edges and barbed points designed to create wounds that would terrorize witnesses rather than simply kill enemies efficiently. Armor was decorated with grotesque trophies and imitating imagery that served to identify the wearer as a Night Lord, while simultaneously creating psychological impact on anyone who encountered them. The void warfare capabilities that the Night Lords maintained during this period were built around captured and salvaged vessels that had been extensively modified to serve their specialized requirements. Ship interiors were redesigned to accommodate torture chambers and execution facilities that could be used to break captured crews, while simultaneously serving as training grounds for new recruits. The vessel's external appearance was altered with macabre decorations and trophy displays that made them instantly recognizable as Night Lord ships, while creating psychological pressure on enemy forces who encountered them in battle. The naval tactics employed by Night Lords' fleets during the Long War emphasized psychological warfare over conventional ship-to-ship combat, with boarding actions designed to capture enemy vessels intact rather than simply destroying them. These operations were conducted with extreme brutality, as Night Lords' assault teams would systematically terrorize captured crews to extract information about Imperial fleet movements and defensive preparations. The intelligence gathered through these methods was often more valuable than the captured ships themselves, providing the Night Lords with detailed knowledge of Imperial naval capabilities and operational patterns. The relationship between different Night Lords' warbands during this period was characterized by competition and mistrust rather than cooperation, as individual leaders sought to enhance their own reputations and power bases at the expense of their nominal allies. This internal rivalry was encouraged by Curze himself, who believed that competition between his subordinates would drive them to greater extremes of effectiveness, while preventing any single warband from accumulating enough power to challenge his authority. The result was a legion that was constantly on the verge of internal warfare, with temporary alliances forming and dissolving based on immediate tactical considerations rather than long-term strategic planning. Warbands would cooperate when mutual benefit could be achieved, then turn on each other when opportunities for advantage presented themselves. Trust was non-existent, loyalty transactional, and betrayal expected. The evolution of Night Lords' combat doctrine during the Long War reflected their adaptation to fighting a defensive war against numerically superior Imperial forces, while maintaining their commitment to terror tactics as their primary weapon. Traditional space, marine assault tactics were abandoned in favor of guerrilla warfare techniques that emphasized mobility and stealth over direct confrontation. Night Lords formations would strike without warning against isolated Imperial positions before vanishing back into the void, leaving behind scenes of carnage designed to demoralize enemy forces and discourage pursuit. The targeting priorities that guided Night Lords' operations during this period focused on maximizing psychological impact rather than achieving traditional military objectives, with attacks directed against civilian populations and non-combatant personnel rather than military installations or strategic assets. These operations were designed to demonstrate the Imperium's inability to protect its citizens while simultaneously spreading fear throughout entire sectors. The systematic nature of these attacks created an atmosphere of constant tension and uncertainty that was often more damaging to Imperial morale than conventional military defeats. Populations lived in fear of the night, knowing that the darkness might bring death without warning or mercy. The Night Lords had become the monsters that parents warned their children about, the nightmare-made flesh that haunted the dreams of billions. The prophetic visions that continued to plague Konrad Curze throughout this period became increasingly focused on his own eventual death, showing him scenes of assassination and betrayal that filled him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. These glimpses of possible futures revealed not only the circumstances of his demise, but also the ultimate futility of his efforts to reshape the galaxy through terror and violence. The knowledge that his death was inevitable and that his legion would not survive his passing created a fatalistic attitude that influenced his decision-making and strategic planning during the final years of his life. The preparation for his prophesied death that Curze undertook during his final years on Sagualsa involved the creation of extensive recordings and written documents designed to preserve his philosophy and justify his actions for posterity. These materials were intended to serve as a final vindication of his methods and a condemnation of the Imperium's hypocrisy, providing future generations with the evidence necessary to understand the true nature of imperial rule and the necessity of the terror tactics he had employed. The creation of these records became an obsession that consumed much of the Primarch's time and energy during his final months. He would spend hours dictating his thoughts, reliving his campaigns, justifying his choices. The Night Haunter was writing his own history, ensuring that his truth would survive even if he did not. The arrival of the Calidus assassin Mshen on Sagualsa was detected by the fortress's security systems, but Curze made no effort to prevent her infiltration or protect himself from the threat she represented. The Primarch had foreseen this moment in his visions for decades and had come to view his assassination not as a defeat, but as the ultimate validation of his prophecies and the final proof of the Imperium's true nature. His decision to allow the assassin to reach him unimpeded was interpreted by his followers as either supreme confidence in his abilities or complete resignation to his fate. In truth, it was neither. Konrad Curze welcomed death as a release from the visions that had tormented him, as proof that he had been right all along, and as the final demonstration that justice, even his twisted version of it, would be served. When Mshen's blade finally found its mark, ending the life of the Night Haunter, Konrad Curze died not with defiance or regret, but with a sense of vindication. He had seen his death coming for decades, had walked willingly toward it, and in that final moment, he believed he had proven his point, that the Imperium was exactly the tyrannical, hypocritical regime he had always claimed it to be, willing to murder even its own sons in the name of maintaining control. The assassination of Konrad Curze sent shockwaves through the scattered remnants of the Night Lord's legion, but rather than unifying them in grief or vengeance, his death accelerated the fragmentation that had been developing for decades. Without their Gene Father's terrifying presence to maintain even the semblance of central authority, the various Night Lords formations that had acknowledged his leadership began to operate as completely autonomous entities, each pursuing its own interpretation of the Legion's purpose and methods. The fortress monastery on Sagualsa became a contested prize, as different warbands fought for control of its resources and the symbolic authority that came with occupying their Primarch's former stronghold. The immediate aftermath of Curze's death was characterized by a brutal power struggle between his most senior captains, each claiming the right to inherit command of the Legion based on their length of service, their proximity to the Primarch during his final years, or their success in previous terror campaigns. Captain Sahal of the Raptors claimed that Curze had designated him as heir through a private conversation, while First Captain Seveter's supporters argued that his position as the Legion's senior officer gave him the strongest claim to leadership. though Sevater himself had disappeared during the heresy, making his claim largely symbolic. Other contenders emerged from the various companies scattered across the eastern fringe, each bringing their own interpretation of what the Night Lords should become in the post-Curze era. The civil war that erupted within the Night Lords' ranks was conducted with the same ruthless brutality that characterized their external operations, as former brothers turned their terror tactics against each other in pursuit of dominance. The fighting was particularly vicious because each faction understood exactly how to exploit their opponent's psychological vulnerabilities, having served alongside them for decades. Torture chambers that had once been used to break Imperial prisoners were repurposed for extracting information from captured Night Lords, while the flayed skins of defeated rivals were displayed as warnings to potential challengers. Captain Krieg Acerbus emerged as one of the most successful warlords during this period of internal strife, using his command of the 12th Company as a foundation for building a larger coalition of Night Lords formations. Acerbus had served as one of Curze's most trusted executioners during the later years of the Long War, earning a reputation for innovative torture techniques and psychological manipulation that made him both feared and respected among his peers. His approach to consolidating power was characteristically pragmatic, offering potential allies a share of future spoils while systematically eliminating those who refused to acknowledge his authority. The warband that coalesced around Acerbus retained many of the traditional Night Lords' practices while adapting them to the realities of operating without central command or reliable supply lines. His forces specialized in lightning raids against Imperial shipping lanes, capturing vessels and their crews for use in elaborate terror. Displays that were broadcast across entire sectors. These operations served both practical and psychological purposes, providing the warband with necessary resources while maintaining the Night Lord's reputation for extreme brutality. Acerbus's recruitment methods reflected the degraded standards that had become common throughout the scattered Night Lords' formations, as he actively sought out the most violent and unstable individuals available for conversion. His warband's ranks were filled with former pirates, murderers, and psychopaths who had been subjected to crude gene seed implantation procedures that bore little resemblance to traditional space marine creation processes. Other warbands followed different paths, each developing their own interpretation of the Night Lord's purpose in the galaxy. The Bleeding Eyes warband, led by the former chaplain Vandred, embraced the religious and ritualistic aspects of terror that had emerged during the Legion's final years under their Primarch's command. Vandred interpreted Curze's teachings as a form of dark theology that elevated suffering and despair to sacred principles, conducting his warband's operations with elaborate ceremonies and rituals that incorporated elements of human sacrifice and systematic torture. The Flayed Skull warband, led by the former apothecary Malcharian, represented the opposite extreme of Night Lord's evolution, embracing complete abandonment of traditional military organization in favor of pure terrorism and sadistic gratification. Malcharian's transformation from a space marine apothecary into a creature of pure malevolence illustrated the corrupting influence of prolonged exposure to the Night Lord's methods and philosophy. His medical knowledge had been perverted into an expertise in prolonging suffering and maximizing psychological trauma. The retreat of various Night Lords' formations into the Eye of Terror represented a fundamental shift in their operational environment and strategic outlook. The warp-touched realm offered sanctuary from Imperial pursuit, while providing access to resources and allies that were unavailable in real space. But it also exposed the scattered warbands to corrupting influences that accelerated their transformation from space marines into something far more sinister. The adaptation to life within the Eye of Terror required significant changes in Night Lord's operational methods and equipment, as the realm's chaotic nature made traditional military planning and logistics impossible. Warbands were forced to become completely self-sufficient, developing the ability to maintain their equipment and replace their losses using whatever resources they could scavenge or steal from other inhabitants of the Eye. The influence of chaos within the Eye was subtle but pervasive among the Night Lord's formations that took refuge there, manifesting not through obvious mutations or demonic possession, but through the gradual erosion of whatever restraint and discipline remained within their ranks. The constant exposure to the warp's corrupting influence accelerated the psychological degradation that had been occurring since the early days of the Long War, creating warriors who were driven primarily by their need to inflict suffering on others rather than any coherent ideology or strategic objective. The conflicts with loyalist Space Marine chapters that characterized the early centuries of the Long War demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Night Lord's terror tactics and their limitations when facing disciplined opponents who understood their methods. The Imperial Fists proved particularly adept at countering Night Lord's operations, using their expertise in defensive warfare to protect civilian populations while conducting methodical campaigns to eliminate terror cells and raiding bases. The Ultramarines took a different approach to combating Night Lord's formations, focusing on intelligence gathering and rapid response capabilities that allowed them to intercept terror attacks before they could achieve their psychological objectives. The 13th Legion's superior organization and logistics gave them significant advantages in tracking and pursuing Night Lord's formations across multiple star systems. The Dark Angel's pursuit of Night Lord's formations was driven by personal animosity dating back to the Thramas Crusade, as the First Legion sought to settle old scores while eliminating threats to Imperial security. These campaigns were characterized by their relentless nature and their focus on complete annihilation rather than simple defeat, as the Dark Angels refused to accept surrender or negotiate with their former enemies. The gradual loss of original purpose and identity among Night Lord's formations was perhaps the most significant consequence of their transformation from an organized legion into scattered warbands of terrorists and pirates. The ideological framework that had originally justified their methods, however twisted it had become, was gradually abandoned in favor of simple survival and the satisfaction of increasingly depraved impulses. Veterans who remembered the Great Crusade found themselves leading formations that bore no resemblance to the disciplined military units they had once served with, while newer recruits had no connection to the Night Lord's original mission or values. The breakdown of traditional Space Marine culture within the scattered Night Lord's formations was accelerated by their adoption of practices and beliefs that were fundamentally incompatible with their original purpose as protectors of humanity. The systematic torture and murder of civilians, the use of human sacrifice in religious ceremonies, and the complete abandonment of any pretense of honor or duty created a culture where the only values that mattered were personal power and the ability to inflict suffering on others. The Night Lords had become everything that Konrad Curze had once fought against on Nostramo, the very monsters he had sought to eliminate through his campaign of terror. In the darkness between the stars, the sons of Konrad Curze continue their eternal war against hope and order, proving that some forms of corruption can never be fully eliminated, only contained and endured. The Night Lords have achieved a form of immortality through terror, ensuring that their legacy will haunt the galaxy for as long as humanity struggles to survive among the stars. They are the nightmare that never ends, the fear that lingers in the darkness, the proof that even the Emperor's greatest creations can be twisted into instruments of pure horror. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, The Night Lords remain as a reminder of a simple, terrible truth. That terror works, that fear is the mind killer, and that in a galaxy of endless suffering, the greatest monsters are not always the ones born in the warp, but sometimes those created by humanity itself.